So without further ado, I would like to extend a very, very warm welcome to everyone. We are delighted to welcome you to this two-day event, The Languages of COVID-19 Implications for Global Healthcare. And it feels like it's been in the planning and preparation for a long time on the one hand, and yet at the same time, I feel like things happened so fast. Exactly a year ago, I just checked my records this morning. Exactly a year ago, we didn't even know the outcome of the appeal to British Academy in response to their call. So I think it's appropriate to take this moment to thank the British Academy for their generous support, which, as I said, we didn't even know it was coming a year ago to the day. And I suppose for sparing us to action in the first place with this call for a grant proposal. I would like to thank my colleague, Stephen Wilson, who has been the mastermind and the spiritus movens of this whole project and who invited me to join. I would like to thank our hosts, the Institute of Modern Languages Research, School of Advanced Study, University of London, for their organizational and logistical support. And especially to Jenny Stubbs for her excellent and tireless work over the last year in supporting us to put together this event. I'd like to thank a long list of colleagues and friends, but I'll only name a few if you let me. I'd like to thank our keynotes and our strategic consultants, our strand chairs, so to speak, Professor Claudia Angelelli, and Professor Lorraine Leeson, who supported us in the organization of workshops that were held earlier on this year. And also to our keynote speaker today, Professor Charles Fosdick, and to Dr. Marta Arnaldi, who have been with to thank them for engaging with us and with each other in inspiring ways, and acknowledge the role also Claudia and Lorraine played in guiding the discussions and developing the overall sense of momentum. I hope we will soon be able to thank one of the leading academic publishers as well for accepting the proposal for an edited collection. I don't want to jinx it, so I won't say any more at this stage, except that the proposal is under consideration presently, and I would like to thank everyone who has contributed to this process. Yes, we are honored and delighted you are joining us today. I can see a very brief outline of the main idea behind this project and this event, this two-day event. There is no doubt that the last 18 months or so will make it into history books or tablets or holograms or whatever their children will be using in school, or what will be their equivalent of school in the years to come. It will come down in history as a pivotal period, which has fundamentally changed the life on this planet in more ways than I can think of. Social norms and behaviors, modes of work and study, mobility patterns, shopping habits, academic conferences, geopolitical power dynamics, mass protests on the one hand, but also surprising ways of expressing solidarity and community and togetherness. We have all been affected in one way or another at individual and at collective levels. And today and tomorrow, we are coming together as an international community of scholars and practitioners, of researchers and agents of all kinds, or perhaps, if you excuse the somewhat elevated tone, simply as earthlings, as inhabitants of this planet, to reflect on the various dimensions of this extremely complex and still evolving situation. Our focus is on the role that language, spoken, signed, interpreted, translated language, has played and continues to play in dealing with the biomedical, social, and political tensions brought about by COVID-19. We are keen to explore the new facets and understandings of COVID-19 revealed by a linguistic, cultural, translational encounter with non-Anglophone languages and societies. So we will be examining multicultural healthcare settings, international public health campaigns, the media and cultural production across the globe, and asking ourselves and each other the question how these reveal new, potentially useful ways of thinking about and communicating the pandemic. So, going very briefly over the program for our two-day event, we have 6 panels spread across 2 days. Today, the panel which will shortly be starting is titled Recalibrations of Language. Later today, we'll have a panel on media discourses, and then a roundtable on transnational cultural responses to COVID-19. And the day will close with a keynote by Professor Charles Forstick on translating cultures, translating COVID. Tomorrow, we'll kick off with a panel translation and communication in a public health crisis. Then we'll move on to a panel on overcoming language barriers. And 2 more panels, the rhetoric of disease and linguistic prophylaxis. And the day will close by a concluding roundtable with our moderators and panel chairs. We're excited, we're delighted, we're very happy to be sharing screens and ideas with you today. And I will now hand over to my colleague Stephen to guide us through the rest of the introductory comments.
Thank you, Piotr. And as I said, my connectivity is not the best this morning, so do bear with me for a couple of minutes, and Piotr can jump in if the connection completely goes down. So whilst I wait for this to be fixed, I'm just going to be very brief in extending my welcome to everyone. Whilst it's a shame that we are not in London together today, it's lovely that we can join with colleagues from across the world and across time zones. We tried to of the program, and we recognise that people will want to dip in and out of sessions over the 2 days. If that is the case, that you want to dip in and out, it's exactly the same Zoom code to come back to each session. So don't feel you need a new code each time. The event is being recorded, so we do ask speakers, please, and all participants, to keep cameras off and to be on mute unless you are speaking or asking a question. We'll take questions at the end of panels, if that's okay. And you can do that by connecting via the chat or by raising your hand and switching on your camera. And the final thing I want to say is that we are trying to be as inclusive as possible. So there is captioning at the bottom of the screen, which you can turn on or off as you please. And we also have some signers with us for many of the sessions. If you would like to connect into the signing provision, please make sure you're on gallery mode. Otherwise, if you don't require that, please just switch to speaker mode only. So I think that's all I wanted to say by way of sort of preliminaries and organisation of the event. And I'm going to hand straight over to Claudia now, who is going to very kindly moderate our first session.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Prior, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here. It's wonderful for this conference to be happening. And thank you, conference organizers, for this amazing job. Thank you, interpreters, who will be also with us today. And Stephen and Peter have characterized the whole conference, so I won't go any more details other than introducing the members of the first panel. As Stephen said, each of the members will have 20 minutes. And what I suggest is that in between the transition, we allow 1-2 minutes for presenters to come on and off. And those of us not presenting, again, with our cameras and mics off, we can stretch our legs, but this is how we are going to do it and take questions all at the end. So the first panel today, and I would ask presenters as I name them to put their cameras on so that we can recognize you. The panel is Recalibrations on the language during COVID-19. And it's interesting to look at that term recalibration, and the 4 papers are going to talk about how language has been reconceptualized, adjusted during these times. The first paper is from Catherine Boyle and Renata Brandao from King's College London. Thank you for being here. That will be followed by Anna Rasokat, University of Cologne. Anna, thank you for being here this morning. Third paper, Patricia Pireda, University of Oxford. Thank you, Patricia. And Beatriz Sica is the fourth paper, University of College London. Thank you. Good morning. And the floor now goes to Catherine and Renata for the first paper, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and it's really great to be here on this Monday morning. So I'm Catherine Boyle.
And I'm Renata Bradel. Sorry, of course there are going to be issues.
Yeah, we had that practice beautifully. We'll start with an ancient precept which says, Salus populi supremo lex esto. Public health must be the highest law. So worldmaking in the time of COVID-19 emerges from the project Language Acts and Worldmaking, and from the simple but important insight that we narrate everything. When we look for solutions to problems, we start by telling stories to each other in our communities, stories that set in a crisis in context, relate it to our historical experience, explain the signs. In an already volatile geopolitical global context, we work through languages to understand the lived experiences of a pandemic that constantly belies, for example, the slogan, "We're all in it together." From our location, the UK, it was important for us to reinforce the fact that the world is not monolingual and monoculture, a legacy that informed so much of the policy, that much of the knowledge we need to fight the pandemic globally is hidden away from us in other cultures and knowledge systems. The failures of the cultural, historical, and political imagination in counterposition to the responsiveness of language that articulates the experience of living a pandemic. So these failures that haunt responses to the pandemic so often come from the inability to move beyond the specific location from which the responses arise. So in Worldmaking in the time of COVID-19, we gathered together 19 student researchers across 12 languages to dislocate us from our place of understanding of the pandemic and to study what became apparent as tensions between global and local narratives.
Worldmaking in the time of COVID-19 sought to investigate the use of language in the newsroom to articulate and to form discourses on the COVID-19 pandemic as a medium for transcultural knowledge. More than 1.1 million news articles from 117 countries in, as Catherine said, 12 different languages were reviewed in the project. And really, from the time that the virus was first identified and as SARS-CoV-2 to when it was given its name COVID-19, certain codes were central to the pandemic's narratives. One key finding in Worldmaking in the time of COVID-19 was that the pandemic redefined our interactions to space, to the environment, and to one another. The study discovered that language is altering our perception of locality as well as our interpretations of distance, proximity, and geographical movements. The construction of this narrative has impacts on one's personal experience of the pandemic, and this narrative has shifted throughout it, and it continues to do so. In fact, we have observed smaller waves in the different waves of the pandemic, if you can call it like that. Despite Worldmaking at the time of COVID-19 researching this first wave of the pandemic, or what we now kind of consider to be the first wave of the pandemic, we discovered that the language, the discourse, and the narrative changed even through this one wave. For example, the findings show a significant difference in how the crisis was discussed before and after it became an European phenomenon rather than a Chinese and Asian phenomenon. The media's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been constructed as something new, but historic context tells us something different. This Orientalist imagery and the yellow peril narrative are prevalent in the media, in politics, and society. And so this yellow peril as a traveling discourse isn't a new concept.
So the concept of world making instructs us here. Nelson Goodman, writing in 1978, invites reflection on the move from, he says, a unique truth and a world fixed and found to a diversity of right and even conflicting versions of the world in the making. Worlds, he says, are made from other worlds, from congruences of systems, and his interest was in the processes involved in building one world out of others. So this is what we were looking at in language world making in the time of COVID-19. And as we came to the end of the work with the students, we made 4 podcasts. And in those podcasts, we can hear the history of the early pandemic, bringing us into direct contact with this making of the present world from known cultural, historical worlds. Thinking of this historically, the responses to plagues are born from historic worlds of anti-plague measures, which provide discursive and political systems. As Frank M Snowden illustrates, and this is a quotation from him, he says, when new virulent and poorly understood epidemic diseases emerged, such as cholera and HIV/AIDS, the first reaction was to turn to the same defences that appeared to have worked so well against the plague. It was unfortunate that anti-plague measures, however successfully deployed against bubonic plague, proved to be useless or even counterproductive when used against infections with profoundly different modes of transmission. In this manner, the plague regulations established a style of public health that remained a permanent temptation, partly because they were thought to have worked in the past and because in a time of uncertainty and fear, they provided the reassuring sense of being able to do something. In addition, they conferred upon the authorities the legitimating appearance of acting resolutely, knowledgeably, and in accord with precedent. And that seemed to us to be a really important sense of what world making is. This sense of a long, increasingly entrenched history of understanding of a type of closed world making is borne out so far in the discourses we've been studying from the first wave, which already seems historic. But what we see is the importance of the vast extension of state power, of measures to contain the populace, of the lexicon of the local versus the global, of the question of how the actions of other states affect our states. In one visualization of the relative frequency of the word China, it drops dramatically to almost 0 when the virus arrives in Spain. And as our Italian investigators say, the virus is always in as our Italian investigators.
You were muted, Catherine.
Yeah, I seem to mute myself. I don't know how I did that, but I did it. Anyway, as our Italian investigators say, the virus does not attach to verbs of being in, but to those of arriving in, arriving from. The virus is always in transit, according to the European lexicon, and so is the language. And in this respect, the importance of understanding how language constructs our understanding of the experience is important. It takes us out of our locatedness. One such construction, and world-making teaches us that they're potentially infinite, is that of distance, of the external, of borders beyond which there is a threat, and within which there is safety. Languages of war and xenophobia grow from this type of world-making, and yet they were so often used so inadequately with little regard for the consequences of words in action.
Yes, the virus was very much linked directly to its sources, Wuhan and China, at the beginning, the start of the reporting, with words like either China or Chinese and Wuhan appearing regularly across all regions and languages. In fact, in January, all 6 major European languages, so Italian, French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, and English, they all present China, Wuhan, and Hubei as a major keyword, generally giving the sense that the virus is happening there and not here. And moreover, these terms, they often correlate to negative words, such as anxiety and tension, but also infection, alarm, attention. So you can see the trend here. The predominance of Chinese and Asian place names and the term coronavirus correlate to more emotive and evaluative words, such as bioethics, benevolence, and anxious. And when we get to February, although China, it's very much still a keyword, the discourse starts to change. And by the end of February, as Catherine suggested as well, the virus, they start to be described as this local and national issue, and it loses its one directionality connection to China. The narrative then moves towards Europe and Germany, with locations like Frankfurt and Germersheim and Rhineland and France occurring much more frequently. And indeed, as the narrative shifts towards national concern, in this case taking the data found by our German ambassador, the discourse turns very much towards economics, business, and sports. And for the first 4 months of the pandemic, from east to west, the discourses, they shift geographically. Opinions and sentiments and their related concepts, such as attitudes, emotions, and moods, influence human behavior. Our beliefs and perceptions about reality, as well as our choices, are heavily conditioned by how others and other people see and perceive the world. Our worldview is often influenced by opinions and opinions from other people. And what the public will do is very much based on their subjectivity. And the government has a major role to play in it. So despite some limitations, sentiment analysis allowed us to investigate fundamental questions about how COVID-19's pandemic official statements, how it was constructed by identifying and extracting subject information from the source material. Sentiment analysis using the data that we gathered offers some insights into the nature of state response and intervention. And we looked briefly here at some examples from Boris Johnson, Jair Bolsonaro, and Donald Trump.
In this respect, what is it possible for a leader to have done or said? And we turn to one illustrative recent example. Did Boris Johnson say that he'd rather let the bodies pile high than have a third lockdown? In a sense, the political argument is irrelevant because the logic of the discourse dictates that the sentiment is consequent with long-term policy. One of the clues lies in the hidden term harvesting, explained in an article of May 2020. Quietly, the title is "Quietly, a Grim New Word Has Been Shaping UK COVID Policy." Harvesting, Richard Coker informs us, is used in epidemiology to capture the essence of increases in deaths or excess mortality above and beyond normal expectations. He goes on, It is, in a sense, what happens as a part of normal life in normal times, but the word also has darker connotations, those of sacrifice, reaping, culling. As such, while it may appear in textbooks of epidemiology, it doesn't occur in national influenza strategic plans or national discourse. The concept of harvesting is restricted to epidemiological circles. And still Richard Coker, he says, but what if politicians promote the notion of harvesting while declining to use the term, where it is not a natural consequence of events, but a direct consequence of government policy? What if the medical and nursing world do not accept harvesting in these circumstances? What if a policy that results in harvesting cannot be articulated because it is unacceptable to the broader population? For the moment, we'll limit ourselves to presenting this idea as a way of thinking about the developing history of response and as a way of illustrating the ways in which the understanding of languages of world-making offers insight into the emerging logic of discourse through the awareness of the unrecognized translocation of a medical term into political action, but not into political discourse beyond its political role as easily contested hearsay.
So Johnson, Trump, and Bolsonaro, they have all downplayed the coronavirus effects before becoming infected. And when it comes to the pandemic's trajectory, the three countries they lead and they share, the three countries that they lead share several characteristics, such as high infection rates and large numbers of deaths. We saw Brazil recently going above the 500 million deaths. But they also share the discourse. Johnson joked about shaking hands with hospital patients in early March. Bolsonaro often called coronavirus the little flu, and Trump called it the Chinese flu more than once. And as well as both Trump and Bolsonaro endorsing the use of hydrochloroquine, for example. And the initial reaction to this official COVID-19 messaging from these three governments was a mix of confusion and outcry, but their narratives was always very deliberate. They are attempting to shift the framing of the pandemic and its actors, and moreover, they play this war narrative, which is also something that we have seen coming from our research. They play it as a part here because they have all depicted themselves as the saviors and the heroes of this pandemic. And the news has extremely and extensively used the language of conflict to talk about the current pandemic. In the UK, healthcare professionals were often said to be at the front line. In China, Jinping called it the people's war. In Italy, Conte suggested that Italy was in its darkest hours. In France, Macron suggested that he would put his country at war footing. And in the US, Trump pronounced himself as a wartime president. So this narrative has always been there, but also their narrative has been mostly positive. So we looked at all the official pronunciations from Bolsonaro, Trump, and Boris Johnson from March 2020 to January 2021. And both Boris Johnson, out of his 42 official communications, 31 have been positive, which makes up to 74% roughly of his communications have been positive. There is one outlier in June, but it's been extremely positive. Bolsonaro raises that to 90% of his communications being extremely positive, with Donald Trump raising the bar to being 100%. So all his official communications have given the sentiment of being positive. And in this excess of positiveness, there are dangers. By ignoring problems, they frequently leave their organizations less prepared to deal with crisis. This pandemic being only one example of many. And indeed, this Prozac leadership of sorts has become a modus operandi in UK, US, and Brazil. with the three leaders being almost a quintessential hyper-positive leaders. And their rhetoric has always been that everything is going well, as I said, very much positive. As we saw throughout the pandemic, Boris Johnson has often dismissed any criticism as negative or views of naysayers and doomongers. Prefer very much to emphasize on the positive. As you can see from the graphs, Donald Trump has the most positive rhetoric out of the three leaders, and it is up to 10 times that of Boris Johnson, to put it into a perspective. Moreover, very briefly, before I hand over to Catherine, because I like word clouds, and as does Catherine, Johnson and Trump, they talk very much about people, and while Bolsonaro talks extensively about Brazil. So everything is very much localized. Everything is incredibly, self-centered, if you can call it.
Thank you. I think we'll finish there. That's our time. But thank you to listening to some of our ways of working and how ideas of world making and also of the digital data mining that we've done allow us to move from our own location beyond translating ideas, lexicon, and how we make our world around us from one place to the other. We're working on our final report of the project, which gives huge amounts of more granular detail, and we look forward to sharing that with everyone very soon. Thank you so much for listening to us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine and Renata, for a wonderful paper. We have a slight change in this panel. We will have Anna join us last as the fourth paper due to some connectivity problems. So Patricia Pireda will come next, followed by Beatriz Sica. I've already communicated with them, and I'm asking now for a 2-minute break in which presenters will swap their PowerPoints. We'll all be back at 10:39 in the UK. And thank you very much for your attention. Wonderful panel as an opening. Thank you. So we are back. Thank you very much for being here. And I'm introducing Patricia Pireda from University of Oxford. And the title of her paper is Wars, Metaphors During the COVID Pandemic, Persuasion and Manipulation. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take part in this conference. I would like to thank the organizers for everything they did and do. So 2020 can be considered an annus horribilis rather than mirabilis after the coronavirus pandemic started from the Chinese city of Wuhan and spread to Europe and then to the rest of the world. In some countries, politicians and mass media began to use metaphor taken from the war to represent the sanitary emergency that led a great number of governments to impose restriction on society. Several authors have argued over the last few months that the massive use of war metaphors to talk about the threat represented by COVID-19 was not a rewarding linguistic strategy. The question is, why among all metaphors were used those taken from war? Were they appropriate in the circumstances? The real focus of the matter lies in emotion because every discourse, as Cisclaru writes, acquires a specific rhetorical force by means of using emotions. This rhetorical force is not easy to measure, but it may be partly evaluated by observing the way the political discourse is transmitted by the media discourse. In the case of COVID-19, the war-related metaphors were aimed at triggering the primary emotion that we feel when we think about an armed conflict, fear. This is possible for two reasons. The first concerns logic and rhetoric. I would like to go to the next. Eccola, here it is. Because metaphor is the conclusion of an antinomy. This is a particular kind of syllogism, and as such, it is a deduction that, unlike logical syllogisms, does not rest upon necessary premises, which is scientific assertions, but rather upon likely assumptions or generally accepted opinions. Amongst different kinds of metaphors, the so-called resemblant metaphors are particularly interesting because they structure A is B, like Achilles is a lion, is the same any logical proposition like Socrates is immortal, the house is white, London is a city, and so on, which according to the table of truth can be either true or false. It is quite obvious that metaphor does not belong in the table of truth, but to likelihood, as far as it does not represent a state of affairs. However, because the verb to be is used as copula, a metaphor can convey metaphorical meanings as well as pragmatic messages that from the point of view of rhetoric can direct or manipulate opinion through persuasion. This is possible because the resemblance metaphor as antonym direct, easy to comprehend, and is not based on the principles of non-contradiction and tertium non datur, but can conversely activate emotions. There are many studies in this field, in the field of cognitive science, that demonstrate this theory, which was already known in Plato's age. Just to give you an example, I mentioned Lakoff's, who, in one of his studies, after having shown abundant use of the disgust metaphors in political speeches, demonstrated that the audience's moral judgment is influenced by disgust. In the wake of this investigation, it has been shown not only that people who are more sensitive to disgust shown stronger activation patterns for disgust-related metaphors, but that all metaphors activate an emotional response more than literally communication. And this is also very important, that amygdala activation is connected to the process of understanding metaphors. In my paper, so I will focus on war metaphors appear in newspaper and broadcast companies in Italy, France, Germany, Spain, in the UK, and in the United States between March and April 2020. I chose to focus on that lapse of time because the use of war metaphors, reached its peak in those weeks. If we analyze the data collected in the English-speaking countries and gathered in the coronavirus corpus over the period March-June 2020, we see that the word war was used around 14,000 times, while in October-December 2020, it appeared 60,476 times, which means almost the 60% less. The word frontline appeared 5,462 times in spring of 2020, and only 1,149 during the second wave, which is almost the 80% less. The main reason of this radical change is that, as it happened with all metaphors, also the word metaphors lost its effectiveness due to habituation and the change of context. On March 8th, about 10 days after coronavirus had broken out in Lombardia, the La Repubblica reported the words of the previous Italian PM Giuseppe Conte, who said, "During the last few days, I have thought of old readings about Churchill. This is our darkest hour, but we will make it." In his speech, Conte seems to call to arms as he compared himself to Churchill and our times to wartime, when the British government and people were called to repel the Nazi threat. On March 17, also France lay in the grip of the pandemic. All French and foreign newspapers reported the war declaration of President Emmanuel Macron, who with a short categorical sentence stated, "Nous sommes en guerre," we are at war, implicitly citing the speech of Minister of War Georges Clemenceau, delivered on November 20, 1917, before the National Assembly. On March 17, also Boris Johnson announced in a press conference, "We must act like any wartime government." And 2 days later, the formula was borrowed by previous American President Donald Trump, who, by describing himself as a wartime president, claimed that US would achieve total victory over the coronavirus. In Germany, instead, where the figures of casualties remained low during the first wave and also after, war metaphors appear in the media only in connection with reports about the pandemic in other nations. The only direct reference to war appeared on April 12 in the Easter speech by President Steinmeier, who stated that coronavirus is not war, but rather a test for our humanity. The exhortation to solidarity came in a critical moment when the European Union was split into two blocs, quarreling whether and how to provide financial support to the state members that were worst affected by the pandemic. So, from March 8 to the end of April 2020, the European and North American media described the pandemic by using the following metaphors. The virus is an enemy or an invisible enemy. The sanitary crisis is a war. Hospitals and intensive care units are trenches on the front line. Healthcare staff are soldiers and heroes. COVID-19 in Lombardy was an atom bomb. At a closer analysis, these metaphors do not appear appropriate because the semantic shift from the first to the second domain often failed to describe the real state of affairs. Let's see some examples. First, the technology used to treat patients affected by coronavirus, first of all, ventilators in intensive care units, cannot be compared to weaponry because medical tools save lives while weapons kill. Second, the metaphor of the virus as an enemy or invisible enemy is quite weak because a virus has nothing to do with a warrior. A virus is a biological form of life whose aim is not killing but rather living off its host. Third, the same weakness can be recognized in the metaphors of the trenches and front line. Intensive care units and hospitals are not places where lethal weapons are involved, and similarly, the stress and emotional shock that healthcare staff endured cannot be compared with the kind of stress that troops suffer from in combat zone. The last one I would like to mention is maybe the most inadequate war metaphor that was coined by Anthony Almohera, a lieutenant paramedic in New York's emergency medical services, who said, "In wars, we see the bullet. You know who your enemy is. This is a war with an invisible bullet. Everyone you came into contact with is a bullet you could get you." This metaphor basically states that any person we encounter in daily life is a potential enemy, difficult to recognize, who could kill us. In other words, this metaphorical way of speaking implies the risk of starting a dangerous hunt for the infected, which may develop social distancing into a habitual form of antisocial life imposed through fear. One further consequence is the undermining of solidarity, which is instead the fundamental feeling capable of making individual sacrifice spontaneously. Regarding healthcare staff, two metaphors were basically used that depicted them as soldiers who fight to win the war and heroes. The first is a wrong metaphor because, unlike soldiers, healthcare staff are not trained to kill. Their job rather consists in saving life with all the means they have. The second metaphor, conversely, might be adequate per se. Under the exceptional circumstances of the pandemic, and considering the professional commitment required to carry out their duties alongside the high risk of contracting the disease and dying, healthcare staff were immediately and instinctively acknowledged as heroes. The definition was so extensively used that on April 24, the BBC published an article titled, "Will Coronavirus Change How We Define Heroes?" The definition of the heroes is basically the same in all dictionaries. A person who is admired for their courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. Considering their efforts and courage in the face of danger and the extraordinary results that healthcare staff obtain worldwide since the outbreak of the pandemic, I can say that the metaphor of the medical hero is the only good one that was used during the crisis. However, although adequate, it also had controversial collateral effects. On the one hand, it fed feelings of profound admiration and gratitude for medical staff among the population in all the countries examined in my article. On the other hand, it contributed to diverting the public from considering the real state of disarray and disorganization in which years of austerity had left the national health systems in such countries as Italy and the UK, for example. This caused the healthcare staff to react critically and often to reject the comparison with heroes. Their testimony speaks against the abstract and mythical image of the medics that heroically sacrifice themselves from the nation's sake. In the most affected European nations, healthcare staff denounced the scarcity of equipment, from basic PPE to technical supplies like ventilators, and generally blamed politicians for the poor condition of hospitals. In France, for example, Le Quotidien du Médecin wrote this article. "Thank you, Mr. Macron, but I am not a hero. This is a testimony. I just want to protect myself and my family with appropriate masks." In Italy, La Stampa in March 17 wrote, "In Piedmont, that was one of the most affected area in Italy, tests for politicians and footballers, but not for medics." In the UK, the BBC published on April 21 the article "Coronavirus, NHS and care staff struggling to access tests." And in another article, "The government failed to buy crucial protective equipment to cope with a pandemic," a BBC investigation has found. And the same situation has been denounced also in Spain. For example, on April 25, the Redacción Médica published the article, "We are not heroes, we are precarious workers as we were before the COVID." Today, it is undeniable that both in Italy and in the UK, health system collapsed. because they could not provide adequate medical care for all citizens, to the point that where the pressure on new hospitalization in intensive care units was too high, the staff were forced to discern which patients should receive treatment for those who could not be saved, which traumatized many of them profoundly. We can now see that one of the negative effects of using war metaphors was to overshadow the structural deficiency of the health system. Fear, moreover, initially caused people to freeze and isolate, subsequently producing an enormous amount of illness in people, including anxiety, depression, sleep loss, and nightmares. I would like also to stress that through war metaphors, the political discourse reduced the concept of health to the mere absence of physical symptom of COVID-19 infection, which openly contradicts the definition of health given by the Constitution of WHO that reads, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease of infirmity. To conclude, the only potential adequate war metaphor, which doctors are heroes, in combination with the critical testimonies of healthcare staff, managed to counterbalance the emotional storming effect caused by war metaphors, as well as to inform the public about the real circumstances under which healthcare workers had to operate during the crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Wonderful paper. And I'm now going to give the floor to Beatriz Sica. There's a slight change in the title. The title of Beatriz Sica's presentation is Words for COVID. Beatriz is from the University of College London.
Okay, so I too am very happy to take part in this conference, and I want to thank the organizers for making this possible. Through me the way into the suffering city, through me the way to the eternal pain, through me the way that runs among the lost. Abandon every hope who enter here. These are the words written on the gate of Dante's hell. I have quoted them up front, but this is not an epigraph to my paper. It is the text that I have decided to use in this talk to reflect with you upon the languages we have to talk about COVID-19. About a year ago, Nicola Gardini, interviewed by Marta Arnaldi for the Oxford project Translating Illness, said that there is a language for COVID-19, and it is the language of science, it is the language of politicians, it is the language of statistics. But is it really a language we can all share and participate in? I do think, said Gardini, that translating illness, translating COVID, is not just entertainment. It is indeed a primary activity which we should all take part in through finding words to make sense of what is going on. In the last year, the language of science and politicians, filled with numbers, statistics, and sensational metaphors, has dominated the public discourse on COVID-19. Metaphors of wars, fights, wins, and defeats. I'm glad that you heard the first two papers about this, have been proposed to the general public, to each of us. It doesn't matter whether we are doctors or patients, whether we had COVID-19 or not, whether we wrote and spoke about this disease or only read about it. We have all participated in this language. By now, we have made sense of what was going on at the beginning of 2020, but it might be useful to still reflect upon the words that we had and those we want to have in the future to speak about COVID-19. Now that we have found vaccines and our lives are slowly going back to something that we can call normal, what stories are we going to tell about COVID-19? And which words are we going to use to describe how the virus made us see the world differently? I am a literary scholar and a cultural historian, not a social scientist. In this talk, I'm going to use words, not statistics. My aim is to invite people to consider in a new light the literature that they already know and to think creatively about the images we can use to talk about COVID-19. The encounter between literature and medicine has usually meant for literary scholars to consider prose and verse describing diseases or traumatic events, for patients to write about their experiences and thus try to feel better, and for health practitioners to read the literature studied by the above-mentioned literary scholars and the one produced by the patients to better understand how doctors and nurses can deliver care effectively by paying more attention to the needs of those who suffer. In this kind of encounters, literature serves as a tool to create a privileged space where traumatic experiences are somehow worked through and shared. This literature can be seen as an instance of what Dory Lobb and Daniel Podet have termed the art of trauma. In essence, they write, the art of trauma can come close to representing the emptiness at the core of trauma, while still offering the survivor the possibility of repossession and restoration. End of quote. Seen in this perspective, literature is like a therapy, and many indeed have drawn a parallel between literature and Freud's talking cure. Diseases are like traumas. They rob us of our health or of the health of those we love, when not of our or their lives. They create an emptiness that literature, like a therapy, can help us represent and deal with. But pandemics are peculiar diseases because they affect drastically not just our health or the health of our loved ones, but the way we all normally live. With COVID-19, for long periods of lockdown, we could not meet anymore, anywhere. Bars, restaurants, pubs, schools, gyms, cinemas, theaters, museums, and churches were all closed. We were asked not to go to clinics if possible, and we were allowed to enter hospitals only if our condition was severe, but alone, without the comfort of our relatives and friends accompanying us. That was not allowed. Threw me the way into the suffering city, threw me the way to the eternal pain, threw me the way that runs among the lost, abandon every hope who enter here. As I said, these are the words written on the gate of hell in Canto 3 of Dantes Inferno. It is a threshold. Beyond this point is damnation. During the COVID-19 crisis, hospitals were like hell, suffering cities, where pain seemed eternal, beyond time or outside time, because we could not know how long it would last and how it would end. If you entered a hospital with COVID-19, you did not know whether you would ever come out of it. It was difficult to hope for everybody, those who entered, as well as those who remain outside waiting. Dante's Christian universe is certainly very different from our 21st century pandemic world. He wrote these lines with free will and divine justice in mind, not diseases and pandemics. Yet it is possible to rethink about our experience of the COVID-19 pandemic through Dante's words, or rethink about Dante's words through the lenses of COVID-19. In so doing, we disregard the historical and cultural setting of our text to concentrate instead on the qualities that characterize it as a literary text. For example, in these 3 lines by Dante, there are various interesting elements. The vocabulary is homogeneous: suffering city, eternal pain, lost souls. This is hell. There is no doubt about it. Abandon every hope, you who enter here. The strong anaphora at the very beginning, threw me the way. This repetition highlights the sense of threshold. That gate is a passage, a very important one. Beyond is hell, there is no return. There are 2 elements at the end of each line. They're always a noun and an adjective. This is more apparent in the original language, where we have città dolente, suffering city, noun plus adjective, eterno dolore, eternal pain, adjective plus noun, and perduta gente, lost souls, adjective plus noun. We have 3 homologous pairs. It is interesting to note the variation that Dante introduced. Instead of having noun plus adjective or adjective plus noun 3 times, he started with a noun plus adjective, then inverted the terms and had adjective plus noun 2 times. This creates a nice variation in a structure that already has a quite rigid mold, threw me the way. It would have been too much to have the same beginning with the same bipartite structure at the end of each line. As readers, a small variation keeps our thought lively. If we were authors, through small variations like these, we would keep a sense of mastering our words and not be driven by an obsession in repetition. In fact, these 3 lines show an even greater movement and calculated rapports among words. Look, the last words in the first 2 lines, an adjective and a noun, are strictly connected because they share the same stem, dol, which gives the adjective dolente, suffering, as well as the corresponding noun, dolore, pain. Therefore, they're different. One is an adjective, the other is a noun, but they are also the same. There is more. Both dolente and dolore share something with the last word in line 3, gente. Dolore is a noun, like gente, but dolente, an adjective, rhymes with the noun gente. Dolente, dolore, gente. In Dante's hell, people suffer. There is only suffering, but this is not a monotonous world. On the contrary, it is varied, as we are subtly told from the very beginning, from the first 3 lines. Indeed, each person, or at least each category of lost souls, endures a different pain. Dante speaks to many different lost souls, and the reader reads about many different punishments. In terms of variations and rapports between words, there is even more. Look at the number of syllables. Città, dolente, 2, 3. Eterno, dolore, 3, 3. Perduta, gente, 3, 2. So we have 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 2, a varied combination. Now look at the stressed syllables. Città, dolente, ta 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 ta, eterno dolore, ta 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 ta, perduta gente, ta 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 ta. As you can see, in the second hemistich, that is the second part of the line, we have a variation even in terms of beats. In this case, the variation is in the second line. The penultimate stressed syllable is the 7th, not the 8th. And in terms of sounds, we're once again given the same message. The 3 rhyme words establish the prominence of O and E, the vowels of dolore, which is confirmed by the remaining of each line with the insertion here and there of other vowels as well. I and A in the first line, U and A in the 3rd line. This is not an exaggerated dissection of Dante's lines and words. As every great poet, Dante chose his words very carefully and was well aware of their effects. Here, at the entrance of hell, we're told in many different ways that the theme is one, but its application can vary. Suffering takes many different forms because people are varied. United in pain, they differ in how they endure it. Identity through repetition, difference through variations. The close reading of Dante's 3 lines has shown us the power of rhetoric. Rhetorical figures have been analyzed in a medical perspective. For example, Gianluca Barbieri, writing in a psychodynamic perspective, highlighted the psychic strengthening offered by anaphora, the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive sentences, which we have just seen in Dante, as well as other forms of repetition. The rhythm created by a repetition allows the patient to reduce his sense of life's unpredictability and at the same time to shape and strengthen the experiences that he has reconstructed using words. Even in this case, repetition helps him reduce the destabilizing force of mental suffering. Barbieri has also considered accumulations or lists of nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and verbs. He writes, with this device, a rhythm is created that makes the structure of the whole sentence stronger, particularly around those discursive clusters that are usually sensitive because they're linked to painful emotions. This tendency can be very well seen when the series of nouns, adjectives, or other elements are ordered in a climax and arranged in an order of ascending importance. Beautiful, amazing, fantastic, mythic, a frustration, a grief, a tragedy. Even with iterations and accumulations, one acts on the container, imposing a structure and a rhythm that make it stronger, so as to protect the emotions expressed by its content. If we think of Dante's lines again, we can see a subtle climax in the 3 elements at the end of the 3 lines: suffering city, eternal pain, and lost souls. We get there to the lost souls, which is hell's reason of being, progressively. First, the space beyond the threshold is described as a suffering city. Then the eternal pain is introduced, a pain that is outside time, infinite. And finally, we're told what all this means: damnation forever, lost souls. Through Dante's lines, we have seen that literature offers a set of tools to construct meaning. And through Barbieri, we have noted that these tools might be considered in the perspective of psychic strengthening. It is important to note, however, that psychoanalysts and psychotherapists, drawing parallels between the language of literature and that of the unconscious, are very well aware of their differences. For example, Giulia Kristeva wrote, aesthetic and particularly literary creation set forth a device whose prosodic economy, interaction of characters, and implicit symbolism constitute a faithful semiological representation of the subject's battle with symbolic collapse. Such a literary representation is not an elaboration in the sense of becoming aware of the inter- and intrapsychic causes of moral suffering. That is where it diverges from the psychoanalytic course, which aims at dissolving this symptom. Nevertheless, the literary representation possesses a real and imaginary effectiveness that comes closer to catharsis than to elaboration. It is a therapeutic device used in all societies throughout the ages. We can use literature to help traumatized patients represent the emptiness at the core of their trauma, as Lobb and Podel put it. Where there is a silence that is difficult to overcome, literature can set in motion a process that helps people repossess and restore words and images to symbolize an experience. Even if, as Kristeva explains, literary symbols cannot be interpreted in the same way in which we interpret the symbolization of the unconscious, they help us make a move towards language and towards a certain process of symbolization. Or else, and it is my contention here, we can use literature to reflect upon the ways in which we describe our experiences and emotions in times of crisis. If we want to diversify the language for COVID-19, we do not need to search for other diseases in literature, but we can use all the literature we want. Today, I have used Dante, who is the so-called father of the Italian language. Indeed, it might be useful to start from the literary canons we're taught in schools, from the words and images that, as future citizens, we're given as the most valuable and beautiful, and see whether we can apply them to COVID-19 and how, or whether there are other words and images that work better for us now. In groups or individually, let's reread the literature that speaks to us. And if we want, let's write stories or verses about COVID-19 or about emotions that are important to us and what triggers them. Let's play with metaphors and images, with sounds, anaphoras, repetitions, and variations. This will help us recalibrate both the virus that blocked our communications and the literature that shapes and expresses our emotions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Patricia, this was really, really, Beatrice, a wonderful paper. And we are not able to have Anna connect now, but she's still trying. So the suggestion is to start a period of questions and answers from the audience. So I'm monitoring the chat, and whoever wants to start with questions and answers, we are directing them to the 3 papers that we have heard as we wait for Anna to join. So I'll get started, if you don't mind. I'll exercise a little privilege here. I really enjoyed all 3 papers, and I think what they've done is they have given us the space to kickstart the conference by looking at language and looking at how we use language to communicate, what purposes are used. And the 3 papers are different. I was listening and I was going through the different data that you were using, and they give us a macro approach from corpus to understanding how discourses from the press or president, and we're going to have more of that later on too, but from a macro perspective to a more micro perspective, when we go into language and we look at the use of metaphors, specifically the war metaphor, and we look at literature as a whole, and we look at the use we can make of literature to help us reflect on what we have been going through, to help victims of COVID to reflect on their suffering. So this raised a question to me. I was curious about how decisions were made on you to focus on one particular aspect. So I'm asking all 3 authors if they want to comment on how did you make a decision to focus on one particular aspect, and how you went about doing your research. So talk a little bit about the method that you chose to do that. So if anybody's interested in picking up this question, can take the phone, the microphone.
No one else.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
So we'll take Patricia and Beatrice after, yes.
Okay.
Go ahead, Patricia.
Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
So, and the study of metaphor is one of my fields, so it was quite obvious for me when I started in March. I was in Piedmont, so when during the first wave of COVID was very, very strong, the infection at that area. And I started to read a newspaper in Sydney. It was quite obvious for me that they were started to use war metaphor to represent the situation. And since, I know that metaphors can be used in different situations to create different effects. For example, to introduce a new concept, to explain something, just for another nation of the language, etc. But they can also be used as a new what can I say? Yes, to in a persuasive way. And that time I thought, oh, you see, this is very interesting, because it seems that they are using the word metaphor just to create this feeling of panic, because if you remember the first time we were, okay, what's happening? We knew about China, and immediately in the north of Italy, something strange was happened at the time. Nobody knew anything about that. So the first reaction by listening this, okay, we are at war, we have to fight, etc., was a sort of, okay, freezing. We have to follow what they are telling to us to do. And that was the first effect. So I was really interested, because I was living myself on my skin the effects of this language. It's not because I'm an expert of metaphor. Metaphors don't affect me. So I recognize in myself that, okay, I'm having this sort of anxiety created by this language. So I came and say, I want to study this. I want to see. I want to give my contribution of this field.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you very much. Anna is in the room. I want to honor Beatrice's comment, and then if I will ask the first speakers, Catherine and Renata, if they want to add something to the why or the choice, and then we can continue the discussion after Anna's presentation. Go ahead, Beatrice, please.
Okay, no, I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
As a literary scholar, I welcomed the call for paper, because it seemed to me a way to start reflecting upon COVID-19, which everyone wanted to do. But at the same time, I didn't want to do it in a way that seemed to me a bit banal or already heard of, in the sense, okay, let's see which literary pieces describe diseases. So I thought because yes, literary scholars, especially now that the public debate is made by numbers, statistics, somehow are invited to justify the usefulness of literature. And I thought, okay, I'm not dealing with numbers and statistics, but there is a usefulness of words and of literature in particular, in which I believe profoundly. So I thought, how can this be presented and proposed? And I thought, I'll use what I have, my tools, the tools for literary analysis, to try to understand and show and share what it is that makes a text certainly beautiful, but if not beautiful, effective, to make a text speak to us. But then, of course, I also wanted to see how rhetorical figures have been seen in a medical perspective. So on that, I did a bit of research, and I tried to, in a sense, to follow that wave, but not with the thought literature should cure us immediately from something. Literature can help us. Yes, that's my message and my invitation to reconsider literature, to see how it shapes our language, in fact, and the way we speak and we express our emotions.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I think it is important what both of you have said so far, because this conference has invited us to look at language in various ways, and to look at what from language we can bring in order to contribute and how we can use it. So it's very powerful. I see Renata on the screen, so go ahead, please.
Should I go first, Renata? And then
Yes,
you.
I was going to say that. Yes.
Okay, sorry, Catherine, I didn't see you.
It's absolutely fine. We've got a way of conversing and thinking that works for us. As you were speaking, I was thinking of the different work students had done, and I just quickly looked up the work of one of our Korean ambassadors, and I wanted to read you two phrases. I'm not going to read them in Korean, of course, but words that came up from this. One is a new word for a person who decreased activity and stayed in the house due to the fear of Corona-19 infection and consequently put on a lot of weight. And the other one is a room, corner, one low, singing live performance person who basically watches media by themselves. And I think that it sort of sums up what we wanted to do. As briefly as possible, the response that came from our project, Language Acts and Worldmaking, which is about modern languages in the UK and how to revive and keep their energy up, came from a real sense of what our other speakers have been talking about, the predominance of certain narratives that are really embedded in UK history, and particularly in UK history around war and empire. There was a call at King's College London called a rapid response to COVID-19. And we thought, and it was largely towards the medical sciences, but from Language Acts and Worldmaking and the work we'd done there, we really believed that languages and the work of languages in the world had something really important to say to science and to government. We also wanted to engage our students it ended up being across the university, in the work languages do in the world and how we create languages, a language and invent languages to speak, and how they're both culturally and historically embedded, constructing the world around us, and how that constructs our identity at the same time. And in that sense, show the role of humanities, because we really think that humanities scholars should be at the heart of policy as well. And two things to add, I think, are one of the things that's coming up from our research is this tension between the discourses of government, which are so often embedded in this world making we're speaking about, and the massive inventiveness around us in creating languages of COVID-19, including literary languages, which we've done projects on as well and created plays around. But I won't say any more of that just now because we should go on. But that in a nutshell is what we'll do. And Renata will tell you a bit about the methodology we've used.
Thank you.
Yes, just to add to Catherine, because as she said, this is very much a conversation. That's how we've been doing the entire project. So from Language Acts and Worldmaking, I came from the digital humanities, the digital mediation. So I was very much looking into the digital, and that's very much what we try to bring into here, and to look at it from this intersection between digital technologies and humanities. Very much trying to, or thinking that, bringing digital tools and methods to study humanities, to study this, with the recognition that, printed words is no longer necessarily the main medium for knowledge and production and distribution. So we were looking at digital technology not as just another technology, something that is it's along with paper and printed books, and bringing it to allow us to look at these things, looking at modern languages and languages, generally speaking, from a different perspective. So very briefly about methodology, for the Language Acts the Worldmaking in the time of COVID, we downloaded en masse news articles related to coronavirus and COVID. And then we put it through, initially we put it through Voyant for analysis. So we did a distance analysis, looking at things like what the basic topics were around it, the word frequency, word collocation, but also looking at, keyword in context. So looking at specifically what it means in each specific areas. And then we started noticing general topics, which is very much the 4 general topics on our podcast, and then doing a close reading analysis, which was really something very similar that we done for the official pronunciations as well. So we did first a general analysis, and then we went in depth on what it means. So that's very briefly what we have done.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Renata. I appreciate that. And I wonder, I'm monitoring the chat. I don't see messages from the audience, but I think we can go back to the questions and answers later on, because what the three papers are showing also is the importance of arts and humanities and social sciences coming together with medicine and looking at these issues, because three papers are discussing a way of approaching critically what has happened, and that critical thinking part is what makes it robust. Any approach that can be taken to call it into question and to look at it from different angles is one of the perspectives we can bring. And then building on Lorraine's question, Stephen is suggesting if, for example, Beatrice has any thoughts based on her excellent close readings on the potential for literature to be used as arts-based therapy or bibliotherapy for patients, for example, suffering from long COVID. And in this case, what would that therapy imply?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, I do think that literature could be used as a tool, and the way I see it, again, it's not that reading literature I mean, COVID disappears, but for example, for patients with long COVID, I'm thinking, I mean, in my paper I said in groups or individually, and I suppose that individuals who will turn to literature are those who already like it, who already read it, and for whom literature is part already of their lives. But I'm thinking more of groups that put together people to reflect upon how they feel, really. And starting with texts that, again, in my view, especially for people with long COVID, who came back to life but still have the effects. You don't have to take pieces of literature that describe diseases, but you can take great pieces of literature where emotions are described, or where you can start a discussion on how we feel based on a few lines. And I suppose that doing this with a literary scholar or experts would allow people to realize, because I mean we have literary scholars have a set of tools like jargon, anaphora, this repetition. I mean, these are things that if you study them, you know them very well. If you don't study literature, you might not be aware of them in an active sense, but certainly you get the power of a repetition, even if you are not a literary scholar. So doing this with a literary scholar would allow people to realize how certain processes in reading make us feel. And anaphora or repetition is, I guess, one of the most basic ones. And so by reflecting upon short pieces, really, you don't need long pages, and you can reflect upon word choices or how words are placed, climax. I think this can be a starting point for a discussion about what a text communicates and what we feel. And then maybe after reading, there could be a part on writing if people want. So certainly bring a piece of literature that people like or liked, if they want, then sharing these. And then if they want, bring something that they have written. Again, not necessarily dealing directly with COVID. That's the way I see it. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for that answer. I think it's also interesting to look at the role of reflective writing and very brief, like diaries and helping to put things, in patients' own words, and then help them also with readings if they so feel. There's another question in the chat, and I would also like to invite all panelists to put their cameras on, if you wish. But let me read now. This comes from Jonathan Ross, and it says, "Thanks very much, Anna, very interesting. You gave several examples of terms that had been contested and of alternatives that had been proposed for them. But I can remember you mentioning an alternative to wave, pele, and it's certainly threatening, feeding off fear of drowning, and has been shown to have been used, for example, in xenophobic or racist discourse on immigration. Has there been any discussion of other ways of expressing the phenomenon concept labeled as wave?" And I think this is a pertinent question for Anna as well as for Catherine and Renata, as they've also looked at wave in their research. So go ahead, Anna, and then the panelists that would like to also comment on wave.
As far as I know, there has not been a counter suggestion, and I think that's to do with the fact that wave actually is a technical term in epidemiology. So epidemiologists will all the time, it's textbook knowledge that epidemics happen in waves, and I think they are more reluctant then to change this. So I actually talked to a public health expert about this, and he said, well, actually, pandemics are natural disasters. So what's your problem? It's also a natural disaster, just as a wave might be a natural disaster. So the fear that you might have of a wave, you are allowed to have fear of a pandemic. Why not? I still also find this problematic in a wider discourse, but I can also see that if it's a technical term, people might be more reluctant to change it. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. Any comments from other panelists on wave?
I think it's interesting, Anna, to hear you talk about wave as a technical term, because it was like we mentioned the word harvest, which hasn't been used, which doesn't come into our lexicon, our public discursive lexicon at all. And I think it's so interesting to think of this from a translation point of view, that you have this technical term that comes into a public discourse and is used in everyday discourse, but in terms of metaphor, it'd be lovely to hear Patricia say more about this actually. In terms of the metaphor, it has so many different potentials for understanding. And I think that when you were speaking about that, I thought there was a brilliant example of world making and of the infinite possibilities of how we use words and terms. And I just think, I haven't got anything to say on how we actually use it, but I think that understanding of that translocation of technical terms, which are understood by scientists in one way, into a public discourse in which we make them into more general metaphors which describe our feelings and our understandings and our fears is really interesting and actually incredibly important to say, because it's a disjunction actually in language. It's both communication and it's miscommunication. And I think those interesting, it's always interesting for me, those border zones where you have both that process of both communication and miscommunication. So I think, yeah, it's just that it was a really interesting as a way of addressing that's how metaphors work actually.
Thank you, Catherine. And as I have you and Renata on the floor too, there's a question from Luis Medina, and it says, in your survey of countries' languages, have you found mostly differences or similarities? I'm wondering if there are any competing narratives or ways of describing COVID-19 depending on countries or languages.
Renata, do you want to go for it? Yeah, yes. You go for it. You go for it this time.
I think the answer to that is, I feel like that's very much standing in the the wall. It's both. We did find a lot of similarities, so much so that we created the 4 podcasts around 4 very specific topics that we noticed, and therefore there were critical things that you could see throughout it, as we've seen from other presentations today. For example, the war narrative was something that was very much throughout most, if not all, languages. But there were small different ways of describing the disease, either in a scientific way or in a very much in a non-scientific way that was dependent on languages. So the answer to that is both, yes.
I think there were some cases in which, and this is why the data analysis, and it goes back to what other people were saying, was so interesting, because you become, well, you're so aware of where you're located, and that you see the world from where you are located. So the data analysis for us as part of the project was really important. So it takes you out of where you're located and you actually begin to see these multiple narratives. And of course, we impose certain narratives that from the places that we've come. I think some things were quite interesting, that areas where we thought there might be a predominance of war narrative, there wasn't actually. And we saw that in Japan, there was hardly any war narrative, I think, in Israel, likewise. We saw quite strong narratives of competition in Russia, didn't we? In terms of the vaccine, comparing it to the space race, for example. So it was really interesting. And again, that's from where all these different discourses and narratives came from. And then from some of the researchers that were looking at a language like Portuguese, for example, made us very aware of the difference between global and international and state power. So in Portuguese, you'd have a lot of journals or newspapers from Brazil, for example, from Portugal, but not so much from the African Portuguese, Lusophone African countries. So you have, so what became contested there was the question of what's international and what's global, and I think that was really interesting. And the last thing I would say, in terms of the different languages that are appearing in the data, and you see that in I can't remember which of the podcasts, but where our informants from Mexico, for example, and from the global south were really picking up on narratives of disequality and of the lack of evenness, of lack of access to resources. So you begin to pick up on these lived experiences, and also, as I said before, on the massive inventiveness of language to relate this. And I think this relates particularly to what Beatrice was saying earlier about, this, I think you said the silence and difficult to overcome. And I think that sort of inventiveness of language that we picked up was really interesting, as I said before, as this tension between that and public discourse.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine. There's so many interesting comments on the chat, and one talks about, Linda Miller is talking about a reader who performs a function that Beatrice is describing for groups of people who have had mental health struggles. In the medical humanities field, we use the approaches of close reading, narrative medicine, and creative writing with fellow clinicians who have struggled with the personal impact of our work, but also our experiences as patients, because doctors are patients too. So I think the more we go from papers to reflections, what we are seeing is how the humanities first moving into the digital humanities, the medical humanities, this human factor being central to everything that has been going on, and at times how the lenses that we bring can help put that on the table, which has always been there, but like language, right? We all have language, and therefore language seems to not be a field of inquiry for many people because they simply have it, but what we can do with it helps in the communication between provider and patient, helps in policymakers and how they approach dissemination of information or accounting for different things for different audiences, the notions of literacy levels and information versus communication and two-way in understanding and sensing that. So I'm really, really pleased, and I hate to have to close the debate, but the chat hopefully will be saved so we can go back and look at that. And what I would like to do before saying we are now approaching the lunch break and we'll be all back at 1:15, I would like for all of us, if we can, to put our cameras and mics on, and a big round of applause for this wonderful 4 papers and panelists. Thank you very much.
Right, so as it's 1:15, and I can see that our participants are steadily joining us, it's my pleasure to invite everyone to the second panel of our conference. And we'll have 3 presentations in this panel again, and may I suggest that you are, of course, more than welcome to feed the questions into the chat box, but we will probably take them sort of collectively at the end of the panel after the 3 presenters have spoken. So the first speaker in the panel is Andrea Lipschner from Ural Federal University in Russia. We're delighted to have you, Andrea, and over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this project, and it is really very interesting. And I would like to share today a few things that I found out while having a closer look at some of the commentaries here in Russian. I'm aware probably not everyone knows Russian, so I try to explain as much as possible about the commentaries in Russian. And first of all, I would like to maybe present what I've been using for my analysis, which is e1.ru, the news portal here in the Sverdlovsk region, and then also maybe tell you where I'm located actually in, because not everyone knows the geography of Russia in detail. Moscow, St. Petersburg, I think is known to everyone, but Yekaterinburg maybe not. Then talk a little bit about the situation of COVID in the Sverdlovsk region, how it has developed over the past 12 months, and then move on to my actual analysis of lexical items in the commentaries. And I would like to start with portal e1.ru. It's the local news portal here for the Sverdlovsk region. It's all in Russian, and it includes news from the region and Yekaterinburg. There are events in town and region which are covered: economics, politics, social affairs, and also cultural events. The site is, or the news are updated daily, probably sometimes if there's something urgent, also hourly. And what is most important for my analysis, there are comments to all articles, which are probably moderated, but I think on the other hand, you see free speech in these comments and how people express their opinion on all kinds of topics. So no censorship that I could see here. Whereas Yekaterinburg located, you see here on the map, it's actually 1,600 kilometers east from Moscow. It's an industrial region, and other larger cities are Perm, which is about 7 hours by train, and then moving on to Siberia. Yekaterinburg is not part of Siberia, yet it's part of the Ural Mountains, and we are in the middle Ural Mountains. Maybe a few more words about the Sverdlovsk region, and it has a population of 4.3 million people in total. And Yekaterinburg, as the capital, has, well, according to these numbers, 1.4 million, but the last number that I heard from locals is 1.6 million. So it's a large city and industrial city with different types of economic sites. As you see, we have mining here, metals, and also heavy engineering, which you can see sometimes when we have smog here in the city, which happens. About the development of the situation of COVID in this large area, in this large city, COVID wave, the first wave started a little bit later than in Western Europe. So it started first in March, end of March in Moscow. And here it arrived, as you can see, start of April. And this first week of April was announced non-working week because people were not sure what to do, what to expect from this coronavirus pandemic. And you see the rise of the numbers starting mid-May until the end or mid-August, and then the numbers were going down a bit. And the second wave, I would see, started about mid-October. So this is when my university moved online again, mid-October, and we've been online then until the end of January. And since then, we've been working offline, which worked pretty well. But as you see, at the moment, we have, today it was announced the beginning of the third wave in the Ural mountain area. So we'll see what happens next. So about my analysis and what I did, first of all, I read the news to be up to date, what is happening here, what kind of restrictions to expect. And this also gave actually the idea to me to collect these commentaries and to look at them from a linguistic point of view. And I tried to classify the lexical items regarding the topic of COVID, everything involved, be it medical terminology or just the way people talk about it in their everyday lives. So I gathered most of my commentaries between April and December 2020, and altogether I analyzed 1,410 commentaries. And here you have an article, well, you have the comment to an article. You see it can be quite large. There is no limit to the amount of words which are used. Then people can comment on these commentaries and also evaluate them. So you can put a plus when you like it, or minus if you don't agree. So this is a possibility to also participate without actually writing something. And you see people don't use their actual names, they use nicknames to stay anonymous in here. So my research questions were, of which origin are the words in the commentaries? Are they English? Are they from other languages, or are they mainly in Russian? Are there any similarities in the word formation? And then third point is actually very interesting to look at, which is how actively do users form their own variations of existing lexical items? So do they use the word COVID, or do they change it depending on the opinion they want to express? And then is it possible to classify words regarding a topic area, which is actually possible, which I found out. So you have, first of all, the use of the name of the infection. How is it used? Then changes or intentional changes to the name of the infection, which express the opinion of the writer. Then types of detection, analysis of the virus, and moving on then to types and places of treatment. And then what we actually had a look at most was administrative measures here and restrictions, which then also changed our lives every day. First of all, use of the name of the infection. You see here actually in English, COVID-19, which was still used here in June. And then I see the development people were using also parallel to the English expression, which is written with the Latin alphabet. In Cyrillic, they use COVID, which is not always changed according to the case endings, which would be needed based on different prepositions or the position in a sentence. So you see this also here in hyphens, COVID, which means the user is not quite sure what to do with this word yet. Is it part of the Russian language, or is it still something which is borrowed from English? And then also a third possibility is to use coronavirus in English. And as Russian is typically using stress in certain positions, and depending where the stress is, you can then speak or are, depending on the situation. So this is the reason why the person used actually coronavirus instead of coronavirus. So this is possible as well. So what we see as COVID is not always used with a case ending. It can be used with a case ending, but it's still not decided if that's what is correct. Then often I saw that people were shortening coronavirus to corona, which means crown, also in Russian. And it was used then with a case ending, or, which is quite long for Russian, coronavirus. Then the intentional change of the name of the infection. Here you have also the expression of the opinion by certain writers, as you see here with Covid-19, which is actually a word which can be translated as mania, Covid-mania, and expresses also the panic by some people at the beginning or during the pandemic. Then also makaronavirusnaya hysteria, which is actually also a way how to mock the situation and express, the opinion of the person, because macarona means actually noodles. So the noodle virus history sounds a bit strange, but expresses actually the opinion of a person who doesn't really believe that there is a virus, and this is actually still going on, the situation. So we have normally two groups in the comments, ones who believe in the virus, to take measures, who are ready to abide to the rules set by the government, and those who protest in the way that they, for example, don't wear masks or don't keep their distance. Here you see also the use of the word baranavirus. So все спишут на baranavirus, which means actually everyone is actually referring to the virus, and baranavirus means here also that people don't actually believe in it. Moving on, then, nouns related to the virus, and this is again the expression of criticism or irony, Covid-dissidentov, you see it here, so like a dissident, and then Covidiote antimasachniki. So Covidiot is a word that came up quite early, I think in the summer it was used first time, and refers also to a person who doesn't believe in the virus and also doesn't wear masks, so it's not taking care in any way. And then another expression, instead of anti-masachniki, you see also bez-masachnikov, so this is referring also to people who do not wear masks, and this is also used in a different way. Bez-masachnikov would be a noun, but Russian is able to change adjectives to nouns, and you have here this example with bez-masachniki. And the last example here, отрицатели ковида, is those who don't believe in COVID at all. See it here again with the translation. And one more example here is отдельные намордники, which refers actually to a muzzle for an animal, and those who criticized the people wearing masks use the word often namordnik, and this is of course quite aggressive way to express their opinion against people who wear masks. Then how are people referred to which are infected? There are again there are a lot of ways to say this. Narcomis covidum, a person with COVID. Then bezsymptomnikov is an example for someone who doesn't show symptoms, here expressed as a noun. And again, 3 different ways to refer to people that have the virus. Here as a noun, coronavirusnikov, and again, a nominalized adjective, coronavirusnime, so a person that is in the same hospital room as someone who has the coronavirus. And another way to do this is then covidnih, pustam na covidnih posmotrat, so I have just this should have a look at people with COVID. And here it's again actually an adjective which is nominalized when we translate it. Kontaktny человек, there are 2 options to refer to someone who was in contact with a COVID-infected person. One way would be just to use kontaktny человек. To make it shorter, you could just say kontaktny. Sorry, I missed an N here, but it's kontaktny человек. Then several adjectives which were formed based on the word of the infection. One you see here, Svetlovska oblast увеличивает число COVID-них коек, so hospital beds for people with COVID. And one more way to refer to people that have COVID is COVID-nimi больными, so you could translate it as COVID-ill people, which of course would not use in English, but in Russian it's possible that you just change the word of the infection and make an adjective out of it. One political item that comes up quite often is coronavirusные выплаты. So this is for doctors who work in the red zone in the hospital with coronavirus patients. And the Russian government actually decided to support these workers in hospitals and give them more money. And here is also often the discussion in the commentaries, is this correct? Are these sums actually paid to the workers in hospitals, or is it just a scheme? Then one more aspect is how to analyze and detect the virus in a person. I often heard also the expression here maska, which is mazak actually, so maska nebrali, which is the Russian expression for PCR test. And here we have 2 interesting expressions from the medical terminology, KT легких or MRT легких. One, as you see in the next slide, is referring to a CT of the lungs, which is expressed in Russian with KT, and MRT is actually in English MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. An easy way to refer to a COVID test is simply test na COVID. And again, you don't see a case ending in this case. So it's just maybe a transliteration of the English expression COVID. Then to places of treatment, one would be observator. This is something that came up quite early. I remember when the first wave just started, people that arrived, students from China, were put after their arrival in these sanatories and had to quarantine there. And beginning of April, mid-April, people also without symptoms, but which had contact to positive tested patients were also put in these places. So of course, people ran out of space quite soon. And then people just were asked to stay at home and quarantine there because there were no places available. And this is also reflected in the second word here, переполненные больницы, which refers to full hospitals. The past couple of days, I've been rereading some of the comments in preparation for this presentation, and I could see that many people were actually stuck at home, had no access to any medical help because paramedics were not able to come to everyone, and people were just actually treating themselves as best as they could. And here, Krasnaya Zona, also the red zone for people which are infected and treated in this area of the hospital. Then lastly, administrative measures and restrictions. And from the beginning, actually, of the pandemic, were a lot of discussions how to call this situation. Beginning of April, as I said, people were asked to stay at home. And in Russian, this was sidim doma. We sit at home, we don't stay at home, we sit at home. And I remember I lived here in a dormitory. We were asked to pay attention to the so-called regime samoizolacja. So it was not called lockdown straight away. This word, as you see, it also is used, but here you have the use of it in December, and I remember probably the second half of the year it was used more often, but the most often used term for isolation at home is regime samoizolacja. And you see here also the play on words, lock down, and someone is also asking what actually is this? What is lockdown? And the word is not written here together. You see lock down, also the capital letters for down, which is actually referring, unfortunately, to a person with Down syndrome, and which is actually used here as a play of words. So people were not quite sure about the English word, and you see also here in December it is used in the correct way. Another word which was used, and I think it's probably of French origin, is plateau, but we also have it in German, for example, which is played with here plateau, which is referring actually to the poet, and then plateau, so the right stress on the word. As a conclusion, as you see, there's a lot of variety going on, and there's little or almost none English terminology which is used here. We see in the first examples COVID-19 it was used, but more and more often we could find here COVID or Corona, which is used even more often. I don't have exact numbers, and I'm a bit careful to actually say which is used more often. I think I would need even more material in my corpus to be 100% sure what kind of tendency there is. What is important here, COVID-19 is not always changed according to the relevant case endings, and which also shows that the word is still adapting to the Russian language, and therefore a preference for Corona, which actually is Russian, is often observed. Numerous adjectives are used, and some of them are used as nominalized adjectives. New expressive words are coined, as we could see with baranavirus, makaronavirus, and others. And then also the adaptation of medical terminology. I was looking at more general text, I guess, in medical scientific text would find even more examples of this, but in the examples that I analyzed, you could see MRI, which is MRT in Russian, and then KT, which is in English CT. Then also the play with foreign words, because people maybe are not aware what kind of word lockdown actually is, and rather are used to the word sozialna samoizolacja or quarantine, which was used also quite often. But quarantine is not implying that a person was quarantining after traveling, for example. Quarantine was referring to the actual situation of a lockdown, so people were not allowed to move freely. And finally then, lexic for COVID treatment, for COVID-related topics, I would say still in the development and changing all the time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrea. A very detailed, very intriguing study, inviting some questions. I noted down a few already.
All right.
Thank you. Our next presentation is a collective one. So there are 4 authors. Jack Mark-Martin, Eliza Nielsen, Michael Opgehaffen, and Luc van Dorselaer. I'm not sure who'll be presenting on your, or Eliza will be presenting on your behalf, I suppose. Right. So whenever you're ready.
All right. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, yeah, we can see your screen. Fantastic, great.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction. I will be speaking today, but as you said, I'm joined by my three colleagues. We're all from KU Leuven. I work at the Translation Studies Research Unit. And today we want to present some initial indicative data from our research project titled The Circulation of Science News in the COVID-19 Era. It's a collaboration between the Translation Studies Group and the KU Leuven Institute for Media Studies. So our project only just officially kicked off at the start of this month, and it will run for 4 years. We will investigate how science news travels to, from, and within Flanders in Belgium, with the aim of getting a better understanding of what happens to scientific information once it leaves the lab and enters the news landscape and influences public opinion. So we will look at translation practices from a very broad perspective, not only translation from one language to another or within a language, but also from one medium into another. The primary goal is to develop a framework that ties together our two research groups and also those two research traditions and the two notions of translation and what is called remediation. We believe that we need those two disciplines to really get a well-rounded idea of how news comes into being in our globalized world. And then secondly, we will apply this framework in a study that examines how different Flemish news outlets have covered the same COVID-19 vaccine research. So today we're presenting an initial product-oriented analysis of a corpus of news articles, just really to give you a teaser of what we're hoping to do at a larger scale. So why the study? Well, translation and remediation processes really shape news stories. And we think that a better understanding of the communications chain behind science news can also help us understand which dynamics and which agents form the news and thus form public opinion about, in this case, COVID-19 vaccines. We also plan to distill practical, didactical knowledge for journalists and translators working in the field. And the third reason is really conceptual, because we will bring together two related fields that have traditionally worked quite independently, namely translation studies and journalism studies. I also want to zoom in a bit on why we chose Flanders as a region. First of all, it was hit very hard by the pandemic. Belgium had some of the highest death rates per capita worldwide. And then secondly, Flanders is a very small region that is heavily dependent on international information flows, particularly from English sources, even though, which is maybe quite peculiar, the three national languages are Dutch, French, and German in Belgium. So for this indicative pilot study, I'm calling it, our research question was, which translation and remediation strategies do different Flemish media outlets use in their coverage of COVID-19 vaccine studies? And as a method, we did a quantitative analysis of a corpus of journalistic articles that discuss the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine studies. I'm just going to call it the Pfizer vaccine from now on to keep things a bit simple. So we zoomed in on three Flemish outlets, which I will introduce to you now. First of all, we have the Standaard, which is considered a high quality newspaper. It's kind of comparable to the New York Times. Then we have Het Laatste Nieuws, which is the newspaper with the widest circulation, comparable to the New York Post. And EOS, which is a monthly Dutch language popular science magazine, which you could compare to Scientific American. We identified 55 articles about studies that discuss the Pfizer vaccine, dating from July 2020, when the first news story about that vaccine was published in Flanders, up into and including May of this year. I will share a bit more about how we selected which articles to include at the end, when I will also highlight some methodological challenges. But we compiled the corpus using GoPress, which is an archive of media in Belgium, and we also used the outlets' websites. So there were 27 articles from Standaard, 22 from Laatste Nieuws, and 6 from EOS. So I want to just flag that, especially the data from EOS, it was a very small sample, so may not be representative at this stage. So first, I'd like to zoom in on translation. One of our aims is to find out more about the trajectory that science news follows, as I said, and a helpful clue are the sources that journalistic outlets sometimes mention explicitly on top of or below an article. So you can see that in the examples from our 3 outlets here. They always refer to either news agencies or other international news outlets, but they're generally referring to journalistic media. So on the left, you have Business Insider as a source, an American platform. At the bottom, you see Belga, which is the Belgian national news agency, Globes, which is an Israeli news site, and Our World in Data, which is a data journalism website. And then on the right, you see that EOS republished an article from Nature News, so an American scientific outlet. About half of the studies in our sample mentioned such a source, and just over 2/3 of those reported an international source. Now, I want to highlight also that reporters do refer to sources in other ways as well, for example, by quoting experts or by simply saying that a news item came from a press release, for example, by Kaiser. So here we only really looked at those very explicit mentions of sources outside of the body text of the article itself. So then the Belgian sources were mostly to the national news agency Belga, though it should be noted that in those cases, it was actually clear from the content that the news still originated from abroad. One of the goals of our project is to further investigate international news sources, whether they are explicitly reported or not, as they can tell us more about translation processes and cultural dynamics. You will see in the graph that, maybe unsurprisingly, after Belgium, the top countries for news sources were the UK, the US, and the Netherlands. We also noticed that at Laatste Nieuws reported more Belgian sources than the other outlets. The numbers here are absolute, but this is also the case when you look at them relative to the sample size. And then maybe a comment on the mention of Israel. You may remember that Israel was moving very fast in its vaccination campaign, and so for while there were many local studies that were covered in the international press, which is why you have 2 sources from Israel there. We then also looked at the experts that were quoted in the news stories. So nearly 8 out of 10 articles in our sample quoted an expert directly, so in quotations, or indirectly by saying that someone had said something. So in total, we counted 64 different experts, and they were mentioned 104 times in total. 29 out of those 43 articles quoted an expert based in another country than Belgium, so that's 2/3. Again, this will be the subject of further research, as this can also teach us more about news flows from one language and culture into another. It was somewhat surprising to us to see that at Laatste Nieuws, a newspaper with a very strong regional focus, quoted more international experts. It also contradicts the earlier finding that had that they had more sources from Belga, the Belgian news agency. So we don't know, but a possible explanation may be that, especially for their science news, they actually copy more quotes straight from international news agencies, since they don't have many science writers on staff. But this again should be further investigated. Just to give you an idea, here's the top 3 of the experts that were quoted. Well, it's really top 5. All of them have become very familiar to people in Flanders in the past 18 months, and they're all actually scientific experts, so virologists and vaccinologists. What was noticeable was that the Standaard and EOS used considerably more experts from universities and other research institutes than at Laatste Nieuws did. This may also be explained by the fact that they do have more science writers on board and focus more on the scientific context of news. When it comes to remediation, we looked at 2 aspects in particular, but I want to highlight that obviously many more forms of remediation exist. These that I will present now simply serve as an example, given again that this is a small-scale pilot study. So we wanted to find out more about how articles were adapted to the medium they were presented in. More specifically, we looked at which elements which were added to the online versions of the stories that could not have been put into print. So for clarity, I'm going to call these elements dynamic content. But they were mostly videos, as you can see from the examples here. On the bottom left is a video screenshot. There is also one long read in the middle with extensive animations. And at last, the news often used menus where if you click on an item, it rolls out and it shows context information about different vaccines or types of vaccines. Most of the articles in our sample were only available online. There was actually one that was only available in print and we couldn't retrieve it online. So 54 of them were actually published online and then 40 were not available in print. Then out of those 54, 22 contained a dynamic element. And here you could see a really clear difference between the three outlets. With the Laatste Nieuws using much more of these visual features than the other two outlets. Actually, EOS didn't use any of them, so they only really relied on text and images. Something else specific to online communication is the use of hyperlinks. More than half of the articles included at least one hyperlink. Many of these went to another article of the same outlet, but of the links to other websites, most were to scientific studies that were discussed in the article. So the so-called high-quality outlets, EOS and the Standaard, include more hyperlinks to external sources, which can indicate a stronger focus on transparency, or maybe can indicate that the reporter spent more time working on the story and therefore had the time to link to the study. So these were some initial findings to illustrate the direction that we will be headed in the next couple of years. I'd now like to flag some hurdles that we will have to tackle in further designing and executing our study. First of all, this pilot has illustrated the importance for a very strict selection criteria when compiling a corpus like this. We want to find out more about science news, but since this pandemic has impacted all aspects of our lives and our societies, it's not always clear to differentiate science news from other news. For example, we wanted to look at stories about Pfizer vaccine research, but not only Pfizer is doing studies with their vaccine, so are many other labs. In our current corpus, we include all studies with the Pfizer vaccine, so not only those by Pfizer itself. Secondly, articles that discuss one vaccine often also went into some depth about research into other vaccines. So if you want to look at coverage of one vaccine in particular, you really need to clear criteria on when to add these articles to the corpus and when not. Here we have included only those articles that either had a clear focus on Pfizer or that discussed the science behind several coronavirus vaccines, Pfizer's being one of them. And then finally, there are plenty of articles that discuss both the science behind coronavirus vaccines as well as other aspects of the vaccination campaign, and there are plenty, such as logistics or timing. So we only included those stories with a main focus on the science behind vaccines, including their composition, their efficiency, possible side effects, and so on. To find out more about international information flows, we also looked at different organizations that were mentioned in the articles, as again, these can tell us more about the flow of science news, but we didn't include this data here because it was quite complex to analyze. For example, linking organizations to a country is not always that straightforward in our globalized world. Johnson & Johnson is a good example, since there are actually 3 countries that claim that their vaccine is theirs. So the Netherlands houses a major production site. They call it the Dutch vaccine. The US, obviously, where Johnson & Johnson is headquartered. And then Belgium, which houses Janssen Pharmaceutica, a part of the company. And actually, the Flemish press often refers to Johnson & Johnson as Janssen Pharmaceutica, even though the two aren't completely the same thing. We also had a look at political institutions that are mentioned in the articles, which is made difficult by the habit of referring to different European institutions as simply Europe, or other countries do this by saying Brussels. For example, Europe has purchased X doses of the Pfizer vaccine. It's not always clear which specific institution is referred to. Another limitation of qualitative corpus analyses is that they can only tell you so much about the source of a news story. As I said, even if a newspaper mentions our national news agency as a source, most news originated in countries other than Belgium. So some journalists combine different sources to form a new text. And we've also noticed that EOS copies articles from other sources and translates them. Additional qualitative research is therefore absolutely necessary to find out information about where news comes from and how it's processed. I've added here a reference to a special issue of the journal Across Languages and Cultures if you want to find out more about the methodological challenges in news translation research. And then finally, while a corpus analysis can tell you that Laatste Nieuws uses more dynamic content than other outlets, it doesn't tell you why, nor do we know how this impacts how news consumers make sense of news articles. Again, we would need additional qualitative data to supplement our findings regarding remediation, specifically to find out the motives behind the choice for multimedia content, as well as the impact that these have on readers' understanding and interpretation of a news story. So these are all aspects that we will take into consideration as we move ahead with our study. Some next steps are to then look at other clues of sources in the corpus, possibly extend the corpus, such as references to press releases or even tweets. And then we also want to supplement our quantitative data with qualitative data through interviews with reporters at the 3 outlets under investigation. This is planned for this summer. So that concludes our short teaser. So as I've said, we've only just kicked off our project and we're really excited to deep dive into the matter, gather more data and supplementing findings from interviews and observations. If you have any questions, my colleagues and I will be happy to answer them.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Eliza, for your presentation. It's very exciting to see the beginnings of a much larger project as well. So thank you for for letting us into the stuff behind the scenes of your larger project. The third presentation we have today comes from Australia, from Anthony Pym and Bei Hu. And I think I've seen there's Anthony. Fantastic. So without further ado, over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Piotr. And look, my great thanks to Piotr, Stephen, and Claudia for the January workshop, which was very useful for us. Now, I'm working here from Melbourne with my colleague, Bei, who is just up the road in Singapore. Are you there, Bei?
Yes, greetings from Singapore. Good evening.
Welcome, Bei.
We're tag teaming from this other side of the world, and I'll bring up the PowerPoint there, which I hope you can see. Now, we're reporting on basically what happened in Australia, but especially Melbourne, which was the hardest hit part of Australia. And I just very pleased to note that Sue-Ann Harding will be looking at a very important part of the Australian response concerning Indigenous communities. We're not, we're looking at CALT communities. CALT in Australia means, what does CALT mean, Bei?
Culturally and linguistically
diverse communities, particularly in Melbourne. And we're looking at the press, very much like our colleagues in Leuven, but we're particularly looking at the relation between the press and ourselves. This is part of a wider project, which is actually finishing up right now. It was focused on 2020. Those are the people in the project. It's cross-faculty. Robin is from health communication. And what we did, we looked at the Chinese, Italian, and Greek communities in Melbourne. We conducted interviews with the community organizations, with the mediators who were going from government releases, press releases, to especially the elderly in these communities. The elderly were the hardest hit and were the most concerned. And we found out were the most at sea, as it were, who had the most difficulty in really understanding and grasping what was going on. Now, the interest of this project for us as translation scholars is that in the press and in the communication and in the interview data that we got, we found a lot of mistrust in translations, as you can see there on that headline. And here we're focusing on particularly the role of trust. This is part of a wider interest for me personally. I see the COVID communication with respect to wearing masks, distancing, and now with vaccines as one example of behavior change communication. For me, it's the same story, the same challenge for the climate emergency. The aim is to use non-coercive means to get a general populace to take action that requires, at some level, trust in something called science. Something called science because, let's face it, we don't really understand it. We have to trust it in order to get behavior to change. So in fact, our trust is not in science as such, but in the people who communicate science to our communities. This is a model to begin with. It's the O-ring or weakest link theory of trust. There is science, which speaks to government, and we hope government trusts some kind of science. And the government formulates policy, which gets out and goes through not only some kind of press or media release. To reach our communities, we pass through translators who are part of that. We get to the organizations that then mediate, they pick up that information and make it understandable to their members. And if you're lucky, we get to behavior change at the end of the line. That's a very simple model of trust. We would assume that failure in any one step may lead the whole lot to fail. And the model is O-ring because it's the name of the gasket that caused part of Apollo 13 to explode. You're only as good as your weakest gasket, perhaps, in this kind of communication. Trust in this model is not to be confused with predictability. It's true that within the communities, particularly the elderly, trusted the people they had known the longest and talked with the longest. And that's a particular kind of trust, but it's not the kind of trust that Luhmann talks about, for example, when he associates it with complexity and risk. Trust reduces complexity. We don't understand the complexity of science, so we choose to trust it to reduce that complexity. But in doing so, we take a risk. There are other people in translation studies who do talk about trust in terms of familiarity. We don't, okay? I'm just situating ourselves within our particular little discipline here. We found earlier on in the piece a previous study out of ANU in Canberra, which shows the degree to which the people they surveyed do trust various sources of information. So scientists, doctors, health experts are at the top. Social media is at the bottom, although 21% do trust social media. So it's not to be excluded from the picture. This is just to situate where our study is. We're looking first at print news or major newspaper outlets like our colleagues in Melbourne. And we're interested in this one, trust local news, trust most news, trust most news organizations. So we're sort of in the middle of that trust range. With that, I hand over to Bay because she's done the hard slog here. She's got all the information.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. So to investigate the image of translation in COVID-19 news coverage of the traditional and the local news, we conducted this keynote search corpus study by using the ProPress Australian and New Zealand newsstream database. By nature, we consider a reception study, looking at how translation as a product and as a profession has been received by the society through media during Melbourne's lockdown between March to November in 2020. So we use different keyword combination to locate the most relevant news report about translation during the time. After cleaning the data, we have 171 articles remained, but it should be noted that although we think translation is very important, as you can see, translation-related reports only account for a very small portion of COVID-19 news coverage in general. Anthony, can we go to the next page, Anthony? Yes.
Oh, I've got it. Yes, there you go. All right.
Thank you. But the good news is that even though it just accounts for a small portion, we can safely say that the issue of translation has attracted mainstream national media attention, such as the Aegis, the Australian, if we look at the top 5 media sources. Yes. What particularly interests us is when and how translation enter into the media spotlight. The line graph shows the number of news articles concerning translation during between March to November last year. The below picture actually shows the COVID-19 cases in Australia during the same period, in which apparently there are 2 waves, one in early March and the other in June and July. Here we would like to explore why translation was not part of the story in the first wave, but become highly reported during the second wave. So here it goes, Anthony. Between the March and May, as we can see from the left side of the screen, there is only one visible translator in the media, Stephen Nicholson, who was the sign language interpreter at the Premier's daily coronavirus updates, so people got familiar with him. During the 3 months, there is only one another visible translation scholar, which happens to be our colleague at the University of Melbourne, detailing talking about mistranslation of China's COVID-19 narratives. Apart from these 2, we can see most COVID-19 media narratives about translation and multilingualism were more or less concerned anti-Asian racism. So why the translation was only received sporadic media attention? Because during the first wave, the COVID-19 was caused by overseas travelers bring the infection back when they return back to Australia. But if we look at the right side of the screen, since the late June, things has changed because the second COVID wave actually broke out in Melbourne's Celt community. And the media quickly linked the increase in cases with the government's health communication with these multicultural communities. And the media suspect that health message might not be well understood by these non-English speaking residents. This was also supported by the media's interview with multicultural community leaders. Then both the media and the government realized that the problematic communication was actually caused by language barriers. So to respond to the media's inquiries on 24th of June, the Victoria government argued that health information had been translated into 53 languages, but the media was not satisfied. And the next day, the government admitted that health communication was not as simple as handling written translated materials. This was basically how translation was perceived by the media in June. The impression is that new cases were caused by problematic health communication with multicultural communities and translation was inadequate. So, can we go to the next page? During the July and August, we see community leaders started to play a more prominent role in the news coverage. On the one hand, community leaders, that is all the 3 green people you see, they are actively call for more attention to Celt community. On the other hand, they didn't trust government's translation, and we see a lot of discourse of complaint. This could be a trust issue, as the community leaders shares stories about how they themselves translate information to their target readers more directly and more accurately. And they seem to separate professional translation from real cross-cultural communication. As one report on the 10th of June said, we are not simply talking about interpreters and translation of words, but more subtle skills involved in true cross-cultural communication. So in the eyes of the community leaders as translators, we are not doing true cross-cultural communication. Media seems to agree, as journalists suggest that house message have to be delivered by one's peers, I'm quoting what they're saying, and they criticize the government for not making community leaders as interpreters. As a result, or as a response, the government started to provide more financial support to community organizations. So to conclude, the media reports concerning translation in the second wave in Melbourne were highlighting the importance of multicultural communication while somehow criticizing translation profession. Can we go to the next page, Anthony? Yes. So in a few minutes, Anthony will tell us what the implication could be. But at this stage, it is quite clear that in the media's landscape, we have some very visible stakeholders, including the health authorities, the Victoria Multicultural Commission, the journalists, and also community leaders and social organizations. But how about professional translators and interpreters? Who are they? Perhaps they made some translation strategies because of their working conditions, such as not enough time. We don't know. And what kind of production norms might affect their translation strategies? Should translation associations such as NATI or AUSSIE should say something about this? And what would be our ethical responsibility as translation scholars in such a case? And compared to translators, social organizations and cult community leaders are much better in communicating with media. And they know that they need to have the representation in the media and diverse leadership at the boardroom table. Yes, and they definitely should. Nevertheless, the fact is that during Melbourne's hard time lockdown, they are not the only group who were not unheard or underrepresented. Translators and interpreters, as individuals and as professional communities, are also absent in the media's coverage. So how do we conceptualize this? I will leave this question to Anthony.
Okay, thank you very much, Bei. I jumped ahead there. That's really looking at the main press outlets. If you look, though, at any kind of social media, on television, on Twitter, everywhere, there were visual representations, as our colleagues in Leuven have pointed out. And the one that was most repeated was this one over here, and the other one was this one over here. And this one concerns some kind of expert complaining about it being nonsensical and the Arabic being nonsensical. And this one over here is easier even because they mixed up Farsi with Arabic. And there was another case where they mixed up Indonesian with Turkish, all right, which is the kind of ultimate insult to the communities with these languages. We care so little about your language, we're going to mix it up with somebody else. Now, these are the images that spread a widespread distrust in translation. But a lot of the problems were not inadequate translators. They were workflow problems. They were bad translation management. There was a failure to test the translations before they got out. Why? Because everybody was going too fast. The result was widespread distrust. And that's the ethical problem that comes to scholars. Distrust in translation is a peculiar thing because the person who needs the translation, by definition, doesn't know what was before the translation. They don't know the other language. And so you are called upon to trust it and take a risk. By the same token, the journalists who were producing this information, reproducing the memes, didn't know the other languages either. In some cases, they did. Generally, the they didn't. And they turned to experts. We've seen that one expert was there for the case of Arabic. So some of them actually turned to experts like academics, for example, like a professor of translation studies at the University of Melbourne, heaven forbid. And there the ethical problem came out when I was asked to comment on these cases. What do I do? Do I pick it up and say, yes, there are mistakes all over the place? Or do I realize that the public does have to trust translators and interpreters? Do I support the community leaders who have, as Bay has pointed out, were very successful in their interactions with the press in saying the translators are bad, we will do the mediation, we are not professional certified translators, we'll take it over, leave it to us? Or do I do what I'm trained to do, which is train professional translators and support the profession? My initial reaction to that ethical dilemma was this article, which was published through the university and was actually rehashed by no fewer than 4 journalists, one of whom got me to put up the top there are minor mistakes in, oh no, I said there were minor mistakes. I didn't mean to. The article was intended to point out the complexities of translation, the effects of pressure, the inadequacies of the code of ethics that translators work with, which are not adjusted to this kind of situation, and obviously the problem of workflows and people not knowing how to work with translators. No matter though, once it's in the press and once you put that little phrase up the top, they pick up what they want. And so my adventures into the land of journalists goes through these particular things, starting from that article, reprinted, radio, pressed. I got on the television. Oh, that was horrible. And interviews cited. I'm in it. I mean, everybody else here has had sort of the great luxury of looking at it from the outside and presuming that the humanities will be important for policy decisions. I didn't have time for that kind of reflection. I was sort of thrust into it, and other colleagues more than myself. I won't pretend I'm the only one there. But you see, there it is. It was a mess, Pim said. No, Pim never said it was a mess. I was talking about the practical problems of doing translations under pressure. But the discourse of journalism needs focus, needs scandal, it needs to produce what is new. And here again, I turn to Luhmann. The system of the mass media doesn't concern what is true in terms of any other system, the system of translation, for example, or of science, for another example. Its function is to produce what is new. And I found myself as the completely naive academic whose words were misconstrued repeatedly in service of a scandal. Now, here's what happened. Distrust of translators was thereby circulated throughout the media, trust was eroded, and cooperative behavior was made more difficult in these communities. But thanks to the press, thanks to the simulacra of bad translations, money came to support translations. And that money went to certainly translator and interpreter services, but also the community organizations who knew how to interact with the press much better, and the distribution of translations, which was the real problem. So there's a sting in the tail. You thought I was going to complain about journalists. No, not at all. I recognize that academics like myself, we are really bad at this, and that the important behavior change, the change in the attitude of the government, which recognized that it was using the wrong media, that it had to interact with the community organizations, as you can see in the distribution of money there, that behavior change came thanks to the journalists. But there's a sting in the sting of the tail. because this new program, which we have now, using all that money that came in from the government, some of that money comes back to us as a research group. And we have now a new project to judge how well the government has spent that money. I'm going to finish there because that's time, but I'd be really, really happy to hear from anybody else who has faced the same kind of ethical predicament as I personally have and as our research group has in the previous or the past few months. Thank you very much for your time.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Anthony and Bay. Right, so this brings us to the end of the presentations in this panel and opens our floor for discussion, for which we have good 25 minutes. So I feel like we should be able to exchange quite a few comments. So I had a few myself, but of course, I'll give priority to the questions coming from our participants. Anthony and Bay, can you see the questions in the chat box?
Yeah.
Yes, so I'll just read it to follow the protocol established by Claudia earlier on. Just curious, says Janus Lee, in your interview, did you manage to include some spiritual leaders from the cult communities? These communities are often hidden under the radar, and even without these spiritual and religious communities, their view on the pandemic can be very different from each other. For example, Taiwan originated religious orders takes messages from Taiwanese sources. So any comments on that aspect?
The quick answer is no, not in our research. Other research carried out by John Hadjic, my colleague in that project, has been specifically on the role of churches and church organizations in language maintenance. And they are playing a role. And faith organizations are recipients of that money coming in from the government. Bay, do you want to say something about the communities looking outside of Australia?
In Singapore, yes, and trust is actually also the key notion, actually, especially in the faith organizations, because people who take more credit of the words from their faith leaders. Yes, definitely. Thanks for the question. We'll take as a wonderful advance if we will continue to do the reception study in Singapore and now. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Any more responses to that particular thread of this discussion from our colleagues, either in Russia or in Belgium? If not, I might have time to come back to it with my question at some point. But coming back to our chat box, there's a question from Jack McMartin. Out of curiosity for Andrea, how did Russian commentators deal with the concept social distancing?
Thank you for the question. I haven't included this concept yet, but it definitely exists because in my corpus, I found, for example, sozialna distancia, which was used quite often, and the second word was distancирование. And here people often come back to the situation in local transport because everything's open in Russia still and has been since, I think, August last year. And people don't keep their distance in buses because place is not provided. And the same is also for queues in shops, for example. So this is a topic of discussion which comes back again and again.
And sort of riding on that or surfing on that wave, if I may, ask a couple of follow-up questions, Andrea, because it also struck me that you were mostly focusing on sort of lexical level, right? But I was wondering whether you had any findings or any intuitions about some phraseology that possibly sort of, migrates between English, probably other languages, and Russian. Well, Jack already mentioned social distancing or physical distancing. I was wondering if there's any evidence like herd immunity or self-isolation or, shielding, bubbling, cocooning, aerate, and stuff like that, which may go beyond the confines of a single lexical unit.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is what I would want to look at next because the number of comments is quite large, but herd community is one other topic which is discussed, and social distancing as well. Then wearing masks, then the different hygiene measures or tactics that I used. So this is what I was planning, and also mentioning in my proposal that I want to look at lexical fields in a larger space as well. And next, what I would want to analyze is also the larger context from a pragmatic point of view, because when you take isolated lexical items, it's sometimes hard to define the actual meaning of the word, because you would need to see, is it used in an answer, is it used in an expression or in a remark? And I think then it's much clearer what the meaning of the words is, and if there's any change of meaning as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Would you mind maybe addressing the following question from Kate Thompson as well?
Yeah, just reading it quickly.
It's about Russian neologisms relating to COVID. Your study was focused on commentators and maybe therefore normal usage. How much of this range of language was used in the official discourse relating to COVID?
I would ask back, what do you mean for official discourse in this situation? Is it meant like the mass media, what is used in articles, or?
So, Kate, without second guessing your question, statements by government. Mm-hmm. Like
yes.
As opposed to social media.
Yeah. Well, politics is involved, definitely. And well, for certain reasons, I didn't really go to that direction, because I wanted to focus more on the language part. But I would see, when you say something like virus or zombovirus, of course, it goes back to some statements that were made and which are criticized, because people either don't believe in a virus or think it's maybe something coming from above that is actually directed at the Russian people. So there's a lot of conspiracy theories going on at the moment, also related to vaccination, which is unfortunately at a low rate here. We have 9% of people vaccinated currently. Probably numbers will go up in the next few weeks with the situation we have now. But of course, people react to the statements by the government and refer to it with expressive lexical items, yes.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Luke, I see your hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Piotr, for a wonderful session, actually, and I'm too lazy to type everything. So I raised my hand. This is a great session, also from a methodological point of view. I think I've learned a lot about methodological risks. Elisa, well, we say Elisa in Dutch, you said Elisa, but in Dutch we say Elisa, has already pointed to that. And of course, especially in translation studies, but also in other disciplines, we're very much used to dealing with that tension between national categories or linguistic categories as well. And after having heard Anthony and Bay, I was thinking maybe our categories at the beginning of our projects are relatively traditional at the moment, because we think in categories of nationality, Belgian experts, for instance, or of languages, Dutch language experts, which is already something else. How do they communicate? It's much more complex than that, I think. Sometimes when they communicate, it will not be in Dutch or in French, but maybe in English. And then when we include the German experts, it's even more complex. And then thinking of the concept of trust, as Anthony and Bay have introduced it, well, that is much more community bound, of course. They think in community categories, which is partly language bound, because even in Belgium, you see that the trust between the French language and the Dutch language community in vaccines, for instance, is clearly different. But it made me think of what choices we have to make from the beginning of our methodological choices in our project. And maybe my question to Anthony and Bay would be, to what extent was it a conscious choice to go for community categories? And how do you methodologically combine that with linguistic or sometimes national categories?
Anthony. I think for this, I think you need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
For you to answer, Bay. It's natural here. Melbourne has more than 250 languages spoken at home. So even if we're translating into 60 or 80, we're not getting to where the real problems are. But it's not alone. I mean, that's where the government funding is. That's where the university research is. I'm between one research center operating on multilingualism, and the other is called the Trust Project, which is looking at trust and communication over a wide number of areas. So it's overdetermined by the city and by the nature of research in the university. But we are beginning right now a joint research project with your institution, with Renne in Leuven, looking at Melbourne and Brussels and language policy in those two super diverse cities. So I don't think it's only our problem at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Luc and Anthony and Bay. Any more questions from our participants? Let me see if I can see the chat box. Yes, there's one from Demi. To Anthony and to Bay, thank you for your talk. Fascinating and very relatable. Happy also to recognize common ground with our work, issues of distrust in translation within certain communities, as well as the idea of community leaders getting better place to disseminate info and educate the public. We'll be talking about that tomorrow. Would love to continue the discussion. So this was more of a comment, I suppose, than a question, unless you want to comment on it or add to it, Anthony and Bay.
I think Claudia's got something to say.
Right, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was just going to say, first of all, thank you, three presenters, because it's amazing. We are getting in deeper and deeper into a discussion. And I have a couple of questions that could be addressed to all of you or you decide. But I'm thinking, as I'm reading this and as I'm hearing and I'm looking at the level of community, discourse, methods, and how to focus or set boundaries or not. I'm sharing also, I have a COVID-19 project in Brazil, and we are looking at vulnerable communities in favelas, garbage pickers, and homeless shelters. And the method we are using is a participatory action research. And the reason behind that is that we are looking at trust. And my question to Anthony here was, are you looking at trust as something that is, I don't know, stable, fluid, as something that's granted or given, because then that may break it into different parts. For the project on Flanders, as Elisa was describing it, I was also wondering in terms of Belgium and the language in Belgium, as you clearly said, French, Flemish, and German, and looking at some of the stats representing Belgium. And I do wonder how representative is one linguistic region of the country or only the linguistic region, and how the translation through English may influence more one area than the other. And from Andrea, I was also wondering in terms of when making the lexical choices, how influenced were you by the area, for example, in which the research is taking place vis-a-vis the rest of the country. So I'm really curious and super grateful for the opportunity of reflecting on all these areas. Thank you.
Do you want a response quickly? Methodologically, what becomes very clear is that you can't see trust. You can see distrust. And so what we pick up on in the interview data and in the media are signs of distrust. And that distrust points you to the linguistic artifacts that are in question. To pick up a question I ignored from Luc, what do we look at in language? Yes, we do look at language, but the signs of distrust tells us what is most contentious, what is most problematic. And I find that methodologically very useful. We don't do corpus work as such. We don't assume that every item out there has the same value. We look at the indications of what is most contentious.
Yes, in terms of trust, if I may use the interpreting term, it's like we look at the problem of trigger. That is what makes people distrust something. And also we look at the implication, like we think the consequence or the final result. If we can have trust, then in the case of COVID-19, that is we want people can change their behavior. So this is why we started trust. We want to look at the behavior change communication. So we would like to what degree of the trust if we can have in order to, it's enough to change people's behavior. So these are two dimensions we are at the current stage looking at. Yes.
Any other comments from the panelists in response to Claudia's question?
Yeah, I could answer the question regarding how, say, my comments work regionally and what kind of influence they might have Russia-wide. Well, the reason why I decided to focus on a local news portal is that I know the place here quite well, and I can actually understand the references better because I know the places, and I can ask local people here what they think about the issue. When I would consider a newspaper, say from Moscow, I think I would just rely on written text, and I probably would not be as informed or could, say, double check the information. So therefore, I'm at the moment consider the discourse here, but it might be interesting, yes, to compare it to different places or to Moscow, which is even bigger than Yekaterinburg. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention that currently we don't plan to compare translation strategies of Flemish and French outlets in Belgium, but I agree that indeed it could be very interesting given, as Luc said, the differences in people's willingness to get vaccinated, which the willingness is higher in Flanders. So that's definitely food for thought and could be a very interesting study.
Thanks very much. So, of course, we still have a few minutes, so I'd like to invite further questions. Linda Miller is saying thank you to everyone and commenting on what has prompted her thinking about the challenges of trust for us individual clinicians and the challenges of establishing trust in the individual consultation with patients with COVID-19 at home remotely by telephone and triaging their needs. This has been particularly challenging when communicating three-way with a translator or interpreter. The importance of eliciting ICE ideas, concerns, and expectations is even greater. Do you have any comments or responses to these lines? If not, then thanks very much, Linda, for contributing to the discussion. I'd like to ask about something I was sort of half expecting to hear in your presentations, and I'm sure that you'll be able to answer that. I'd like to relate the question of trust to transnational or international relations, right? Not just trusting within the larger national community, but trusting each other or distrusting each other rather. What about these stigmatizing expressions that we've seen a lot on the British TV in the early days, especially? There was talk of of course, the Chinese virus, with Donald Trump and everything else. But then, uncomfortably, we had a British variant at some points, which was picked up by a number of European outlets, and I also follow Polish news outlets, and it was just called British variant, quite immediately. The British media distanced itself from it and started calling it the Kent variant, I think, for some time. And then, of course, we had the Indian variant. But by then, I felt that the sensitivity had built up enough for journalists to be more aware of it and started using, the Delta terminology, right, the Greek letters for the variants, or the descriptive phrase, the variant first identified in India or in wherever else. have you seen similar trends of developing certain stigmatizing patterns and then trying to maybe counteract this tendency?
I could start because I think last week media here in Russia started to speak about the Indian virus. They don't use actually the real name for Delta. So I'm curious what's going to happen here, because we have also a very multicultural community here, and I find it a bit difficult. I also talked to my neighbor, he's actually from India, what he's thinking about calling it the Indian virus here in Russia. Is it the Indian virus? Is it a mutation of the Indian virus? No one knows, but it is, as you say, it's stigmatized. I'm curious how the media will deal with it here in Russia.
I believe it was a decision by the WHO to change the name. So it's a top-down decision to call it Delta. And the news media in Australia have changed in the past week to using that.
Right. Relatively recently, right? Though. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In fact, I was amazed at how fast it came through. There were a couple of days when they would use India Delta in the same sentence, so people would make the connection. And then the other was lost very quickly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Very interesting. Mm-hmm.
Same in Belgium, I think. Oh, yeah, Elisa, you know better than I do because you studied it.
It was the same pattern as in Australia, it seems. It was very quick switch. And also I wanted to add another example, which I've noticed is regarding the Russian vaccine. There was also a lot of problematic, I think, terminology around it. A lot of quotations where they wouldn't have put that for vaccines originating in the US. So that's also a very interesting case to study. Only now they still don't really call it by their name. They just call it the Russian vaccine, or it's Pfizer or Moderna, or but now it's more neutral. But it was definitely not neutral before.
But actually, Sputnik is not used.
Sometimes, yeah.
All right, interesting.
Well, even that has led to a national reaction, because I've read that in Greece, some people opposed to the idea of Delta or using Greek characters, because then it sounds like being a Greek virus. So you see, the national categories are still top of mind, I think. And we all still talk 100 years later about the Spanish flu and not the, I don't know, Alpha or Delta or Beta flu.
Absolutely. Yes, very opposite. The poor Greeks are being penalized for having such a handy alphabet. Right. Do any of our Leuven colleagues want to respond to Demi's points in the chat box? And in the meantime, if I may, I would just like to ask a quick follow-up question to Bei and Anthony's presentation. You mentioned at some point, and I didn't snap a picture of your slide, where you said that some government official mentioned that translation or language translation is not enough. And I was wondering, did they elaborate on it? So if it's not enough, so what exactly is missing? Because to me, that would seem to capture the essence of successful translation, right? What is it that goes beyond linguistic mediation? What did they think was missing?
I think it really depends how we define translation. As translation researchers, scholars, we try to define translation as broad as possible, like involve all the features and characteristics of cross-cultural communication, but to the government, to the community leaders, and to the laymen, to the public, it usually just refers to written translation or the multilingual website. So it's all about word in documents. So that's why the media and the community leaders and the government suggest that we need more than translation. We need true cross-cultural communication. So for us, it's quite strange to separate these two things. But we can see actually, if we take the society in general, the way people define translation were quite different from what we prefer or what we look forward to hear or see, right? Yeah.
Sure, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
that prompts my question, because I understand this comment came not from a translation studies scholar, but from a member of the public, right, of the representative of the government, who suddenly found himself or herself sort of pinned down the most important thing of translation, right? That it's beyond linguistic mediation. I was wondering whether that prompted any reflection. So what is it exactly that we're missing? Even if we have the language or the linguistic layer transmitted, is it trust? Is it the source it's coming from, linking to the notion of trust? Is it the sort of the recognition of some conceptual, cultural, religious mediation? What is it that we're missing?
What's missing is a conversation. Another study that Bei has done is on WeChat being used by the Chinese-speaking communities in Melbourne. The information comes in and it's discussed, it's turned around, it's compared with China, there's for and against. And that's when it can lead to, let's not use comprehension or understanding, but potentially behavior change. So I'm becoming more and more interested in lots of the audiovisual media, for example, where all the comments are coming in and people are really discussing translated products as a way of receiving them. I think our research has to move far more in that direction.
Fantastic. I think that's a great insight, actually, that translation is about, it's by definition, it's double how to put it, or multiple directional, right? That it just has to flow and has to be negotiated and responded to and challenged.
But it's not enough just to use a text. And that's become very, very clear in this case study.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, that translation becomes a way in which we enact relationships, right? And not a way of circulating texts. Looking at the clock, I feel like we have just time for the final comment from Lorraine and maybe a quick response to it. Anthony and Bei, you know that trust is hidden, Lorraine writes, but mistrust is visible. This is one that skews attempts to look at success models. Our attention goes to problems, and yet it is when we identify problems that we often secure investment. Is there a way around this? How does your work, the work you've done or are doing, just for me, would you like to respond to that briefly without me trying to find the rest of Lorraine's comment?
If we look at the cases of distrust or mistrust, we can take it as the problem or the risk, and we try to manage the risks. So it goes back to the risk management, and risk management can hopefully to produce some, successful models, like we can try to avoid this kind of risk or reduce it, mitigate it. That's what Anthony's expertise, right? So this is one way we see how to look at the problem first and try to solve it in order to build a successful model, hopefully, yes. Anthony?
Oh yeah, I'm learning from the journalist now.
Okay. Right, so the discussion is going on in the comments. I hope you'll be able to download it and make it available to the participants. But if not, just please take your, copy the comments that you feel might be stimulating or important or relevant to your presentation. And I'm aware that this is a time for our world is a break. So if we're going to reconvene in roughly a half an hour's time at 3:15. But let me say a big thank you to all our panelists and presenters and members of our audience who got engaged in this stimulating discussion. Thanks very much. And we hope to hear, especially from those of you, all of you actually, who announced that this is a beginning of bigger projects. So yes, a big round of applause. Thank you very much.